Hi everyone, Novels Wonderland here. Welcome back to the channel.
Welcome to Novel Wonderland, Lord of the Mysteries, The Witch's Fate. Chapter 1. Chapter 1 to 21 Transmigration. 1984 words. Above the Sapphira Castle, within the Divine Kingdom. A divine war that determined the fate of the entire world quietly drew to a close. The last victor, a truly great existence worthy of the name the Fool, Klein, raised his head toward the dark teal gate of light that represented the Sapphira Castle itself, where transparent cocoons hung suspended one by one. Each cocoon contained a life forcibly frozen in time, just as his own once had been. After a brief moment of connection, Klein closed his fingers. All the cocoons shattered at once. Those wrapped inside dissolved into points of light and flew out of the Sapphira Castle, falling toward people who had just died in the real world, beginning their thoroughly transformed lives anew. But Klein, plagued by the awakening will of the celestial worthy, had no energy to notice the joke fate had played. Some people's lives were better off not continuing. PS1. All world building and settings in this story originate from Lord of the Mysteries by Cuttlefish that loves diving. Readers interested in those settings are welcome to check out that completed work. Those who haven't read it need not worry, neither has the protagonist. I promise to explain everything clearly. PS2. Genderbender element appears after the opening, not at the beginning. No solo content in later chapters. Read at your own discretion. PSMC name is Shwegang. Change it to Ryan. Later on in the story he will have a female name. Title: Mysteries, The Witch's Fate. Author: Raw. Link: https://1coup.red.qq.com. Detail 1056841936. Source equals m_jump. Chapter 1 Transmigration. Ryan jolted awake from a deep sleep, shooting upright and gasping for breath. He couldn't remember why, but an overwhelming sense of dread and terror had been seared deep into his soul. With no time for him to catch his breath, a dense, crawling pain spread across his arm. He looked down instinctively and froze in horror. Scale-like patches, resembling fish or snake scales, were burrowing into his flesh. Countless scales writhed and twisted like living things, drilling into his arm one after another. What the hell? Ryan reflexively flung both arms outward. It was pure instinct. He didn't actually expect it to do anything. So when the pain vanished with the motion, he was baffled. That's not right. Even if they'd already burrowed all the way in, shouldn't there be some sign of them? These things couldn't have drilled into his flesh just to take a nap, could they? He examined his arm in confusion. Whether this counted as good news was debatable, but there wasn't a single wound on it, as if the pain and the scales had been nothing but a hallucination. The worst news was that the arm didn't belong to him at all. In fact, Ryan did a quick sweep of himself and his surroundings. To put it precisely, nothing here was his, not the body, not the room. He was not, and could not be, a hulking slab of a man who actually deserved words like broad-shouldered and barrel-chested. Nor could he possibly be sleeping in a room from the last century that didn't even have a light. He stared blankly around the absurdly sparse space, a table, a wooden wardrobe against one wall, and a bed beside it. That was the room in its entirety. As for lighting, it ran entirely on the crimson moonlight filtering in through the window. Where the hell did I end up? Ryan pressed his fingers to the stranger's temple and rubbed. His head throbbed, his thoughts a jumbled mess. He was certain he'd been lying in bed scrolling on his phone just moments ago, without any stroke of outlandish luck. What was with this transmigration level situation? This probably isn't a dream within a dream, Ryan muttered. Because both the terror and the pain had been far too real. Even so, his hand honestly reached down and gave his thigh a hard pinch. Oh. This guy is built. The sharper-than-expected pain reminded him once again that this was not his original body. I actually transmigrated. That can't be right. I was lying in bed perfectly fine. Ryan was at a loss. He found it difficult to believe what he was seeing, but the leg noticeably thicker than his own was transmitting an undeniably real and vivid ache. After a moment's hesitation, he tried to sift through his memories, curious whether there was anything new in his head. If there wasn't, wouldn't that make it more likely this was just a dream? Everything around him right now looked nothing like a dream, but even the most absurd dream was more probable than him transmigrating out of nowhere, doing absolutely nothing to trigger it. He could swear on his life he hadn't had any stroke of outlandish luck. But that small hope was crushed by reality without mercy. As he reached into his memories, he did recall fragments of a stranger's life that had absolutely nothing to do with him. The last thread of hope quietly died. He really had transmigrated. On an ordinary, uneventful evening, without a single sign or warning, he had transmigrated into someone else's body. My phone. My games. I want to file a complaint. If transmigration is real, is there something like a space-time management bureau that handles this kind of thing? I didn't get any stroke of luck. This is an illegal migration. Ryan felt himself spiraling. He waited a few seconds. No voice, no figure materialized. Web novels have misled me badly. He let out a long sigh and resigned himself to combing through these memories that weren't his. Things are what they are. Figure out the situation first. Because here it was, the middle of the night, and this guy was just lying on the floor. By the crimson moonlight, Ryan could even make out the shattered glass bottle nearby. Something had clearly gone very wrong on this end. The memories, when he dug into them, wiped the expression right off his face. Gambling addiction, got thrown out of the family home. Chased rumors of supernatural power. Believed a scrap of paper at face value. Dead on his own doorstep in the dead of night. 4 sentences summed up everything that had happened to this poor idiot. And the cause of death. 2 words, self-destruction. He had genuinely believed a man he'd only met twice, the one who'd sold him a slip of paper. He'd spent 3 years scouring the occult black markets of several cities for the ingredients listed on that scrap, calling it a potion formula. Then, the very night he finally gathered everything, he mixed them together, drank whatever came out, and died chasing so-called supernatural power. As for occultism, anything related to supernatural power broadly fell under its umbrella. Even though most people in this world didn't believe occultism was real, there was no shortage of people obsessed with it. By any measure, this looked like a fool who trusted a con man, brewed a dubious remedy from an unverified recipe, and successfully poisoned himself to death. That's exactly what Ryan would have thought if he didn't have this big idiot's memories. If the memories didn't clearly show that those mostly solid ingredients, simply mixed together, had genuinely transformed into a pool of dim, unassuming liquid that made you inexplicably thirsty for no reason. And if the strange sensations the idiot experienced while dying weren't eerily similar to what Ryan had felt waking up and far too bizarre to be chalked up to poisoning, he would have thought exactly that. As for those sensations, dread and terror was a simplification. The real experience defied precise description. If Ryan had to put it into words, it was like going mad while remaining fully lucid. More accurately, every part of him, mind included, plunged into some frenzied state, raging at everything within reach, venting a pain that had no name. And yet he stayed conscious through all of it, watching every inch of himself, including his own mind, howl and thrash as if something alive had taken over. He'd never drunk anything he shouldn't have, and he'd never died before. But he instinctively felt that experience was no hallucination. It had been far too vivid, too searing, too deeply unsettling, the kind of thing that sent ice crawling across your skin just at the memory of it. Even now, with those sensations faded, the mere thought of them stirred the same impulse, a mirror image of the feeling in that moment, an urge to destroy everything around him, himself included. Ryan shook his head hard, forcing himself away from those now disturbing impressions. And the strangeness didn't stop there. Perhaps because the big idiot was dead, or perhaps because of the potion itself, the memories were fragmented and riddled with gaps. Even ones that should have left a strong impression were blurred, like his birth parents' names. Or the scrap of paper he'd treasured for years, convinced it would grant him supernatural power. Ryan couldn't reconstruct its exact contents. He picked himself up off the floor and quickly skimmed through what memories remained, confirming this was true across the board. Everything was impressionistic at best, hazy and broken, completely stripped of continuity and missing a heap of specific details. It left him wondering whether he'd even be able to read the writing in this world, and it left him cursing the gambling addict whose shoes he now wore. You've managed to endanger yourself and potentially me too. You absolutely deserved to get conned. If you'd just asked the formula seller to demonstrate this so-called supernatural power first, I'd at least give you a point for having some sense. Oh, when did I stop noticing how cold this floor is? Great. Hope transmigrating into this idiot hasn't dragged my IQ down with him. He'd paid special attention to the memory of when the big guy had purchased the potion formula. The seller said it, the idiot believed it, zero hesitation, zero skepticism. Objectively speaking, the seller hadn't completely lied. From the big guy's memories, Ryan could confirm that what happened when the potion was brewed would have defied common sense even by the standards of this world. Still not a reason for you, you idiot, to believe it was going to give you supernatural power. Ryan exhaled slowly, pulling himself back to calm. He turned his attention to the only table in the room, where a stone-weighted slip of paper lay the potion formula. Sequence 9, Assassin. Primary ingredients, root tendrils of the shadow poison flower, black feathers of the cockatrice. Secondary ingredients, 100 milliliters concentrated vinegar, 3 petals of the shadow poison flower, 10 drops of buttercup essential oil, 1 live spider. Assassin. Ryan had just allowed himself a small sigh of relief at still being able to read the script of this other world and then glanced at his current stocky frame. He almost laughed. But when his gaze drifted to the boxes on the table containing the materials listed in the formula, he went completely silent. Familiar objects nudged the memories back to life, and Ryan recalled a scene so ridiculous he didn't know whether to laugh or despair. Before brewing the potion, the big idiot had discovered that the live spider, one of the secondary ingredients, was dead. Rather than go catch a new one, he'd shrugged it off with close enough and gone ahead without it. You absolutely deserved it, Ryan finally thought, no longer holding back. You really, truly deserved everything you got. Author's note, this chapter my phone, my games. I want to file a complaint. March 20, 8:32 Guangdong. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Is there any hope for me? 1,607 words. How can anyone be this reckless? Who do you think you are, the main character? Ryan was baffled and a little tempted to curse someone out. He'd initially figured that whatever killed the big idiot, since he'd woken up with no obvious physical issues, things were probably fine. But now he had to admit, he was rattled. Learning about this series of probably doesn't make much difference decisions, Ryan felt the odds of hidden complications or outright false recovery climbing fast. The one thought running through his head, is there any hope for me? The image of those scale-like things from when he first woke up flashed back to him. What if they were just dormant? Shoving everything else aside, he immediately dug back into the newly surfaced memory fragments. Understanding the situation had originally been about figuring out why he'd transmigrated, but that could wait. Besides, he instinctively didn't buy that a potion called Assassin, just because one ingredient was wrong, had somehow gained the power to transmigrate people. Believing that was less reasonable than treating transmigration as an astronomically rare random event. Still, the memory fragments were a disappointment, though not a surprise the big idiot hadn't cared in the slightest what any of these ingredients actually did. From the new fragments, Ryan could only piece together the following. The Assassin potion had subsequent tiers, Sequence 8, Sequence 7, all the way down to Sequence 1. The lower the number, the greater the supernatural power granted. After adapting to and mastering a given sequence, you were required to take the next potion in order or death was the only other outcome. Furthermore, there was more than one potion lineage. The two Orthodox churches in this country, the Church of the Night and the Church of the Storm, each possessed their own distinct Sequence 9 potions and the tiers that followed. And once you drank the Assassin potion, you had to seek out the Assassin lineage Sequence 8, no substituting another Sequence 8 from a different lineage, or you'd die for that too. That was the gist. There were a few claims he couldn't verify, like Sequence 4 and beyond rivaling the saints recorded in church doctrine, so Ryan didn't put much stock in those. Honestly, this was all useful knowledge, but it didn't stop him from feeling ready to throw a punch. At least ask what counts as a success and what counts as failure. At minimum, what abilities does the Assassin potion actually give? Then I'd at least know whether I should be panicking. But from the memory fragments, Ryan could tell the big idiot had this inexplicable confidence in himself, and hadn't entertained the possibility of failure for even a second. Fantastic. He stared at the ceiling, rubbing his temples. Does surviving count as success, and dying count as failure? Then what does dying and coming back make me? This was a headache. One perfectly ordinary death had become needlessly complicated because of his transmigration. Without any prior knowledge of this world's supernatural system, he had no way to gauge whether any of the information in these memory fragments was actually true. He wasn't like the big idiot, he didn't take everything at face value. Running through everything that had happened since he woke up, the only things he could confirm as real were two: he had definitely transmigrated, and this so-called potion could definitely produce something inexplicable. What do I do now? Feels like a dead end. Time to change approach. Assume the formula is real and the missing ingredient didn't matter. Assume waking up means I successfully obtained supernatural power. What state am I in, exactly? He let that thought run. A supernatural power called assassin, what would make it distinct? Invisibility. One-hit kills to vital points. What he didn't expect was for the memories themselves to give him the most precise answer the moment he focused on the question. And unlike the big idiot's hazy, fragmented recollections that took effort to surface, these were sharp, complete, and clearly intact. Even before he'd confirmed anything, he felt certain enough that the dread he'd been holding back loosened, just slightly. The knowledge felt as natural as if it had been written into his DNA. It felt so familiar that he had the strange, disorienting impression of being a veteran assassin with decades of experience under his belt, not a fresh graduate who'd barely worked a few months. Of course, feelings were feelings. Ryan still ran through the contents carefully. Tracking. Disguise. Stealth. Combat. Eagle eye. Night vision. Acute hearing. Danger intuition. Shadow concealment. Full force strike. Feather fall. The more he read, the more surreal it felt, like he'd been hit in the head by a pie falling from the sky. The most optimistic scenario he'd casually imagined was actually true. The seller, who looked every bit a con artist, was telling the truth. The formula specifically called for a live spider, and it not being alive made no difference. This was the most basic sequence 9, and yet he didn't need to figure anything out himself. It was as if a complete instruction manual had been downloaded directly into his brain. I haven't transmigrated into a video game, have I? Given the situation, it was a natural thought for someone steeped in web fiction. The potions really did resemble character classes, just without a status screen, skill descriptions loaded straight into your head. The only difference was that no game would lock a player into a single build with no class changes allowed, where leveling up wrong meant a permanent game over. Unless he wasn't the player. He sat with that thought for a few seconds, then shook his head and pushed it away. Whether this was a game wasn't something he could figure out from inside a room. And calm reflection told him he might be getting ahead of himself. What if the instruction manual was perfectly accurate, but the actual product was something different entirely? So Ryan decided to step outside and test it. He wanted to see whether his actual supernatural abilities matched the manual in his head. If they did, he felt like he could let himself relax at least halfway. Decided, he moved. His life was on the line, and when that was the case, he had no trouble taking action. That's when he noticed something he probably should have caught earlier. Just by shifting his attention away from the table and looking toward the corners the crimson moonlight didn't reach, it was obvious he had night vision. Tonight's moon wasn't particularly bright, and yet the outlines of everything in the room were unusually sharp. So I spent all that time overthinking, and the answer was right there. He had no one to blame but himself. Who stays calm when something like this happens? After that mild self-consolation, Ryan moved away from the table by the window and stepped into the moonlight-free shadows. Shadow concealment required being physically inside a shadow to activate. Without any preamble, as easily as flexing a finger, his body simply vanished into the dark. He glanced around, then decided to head outside and test the rest. This place was bleak enough he didn't want to accidentally wreck it. It was the only roof over his head. He pulled the door shut behind him and turned for one last look at the building, its silhouette still crisp in the night. It gave him the strange sensation of looking at a place that had already moved on without him. He had to admit, as dim-witted as the big idiot had been in chasing supernatural power, Ryan had genuinely benefited from it. Not only did he now have abilities, he had a roof over his head until at least next month. I didn't exactly want to inherit anything from you, but I don't have a way to give it back. And this world doesn't have the tradition of burning paper offerings. So maybe I just won't disturb your parents. Without you, they'll probably be better off. The money the big idiot had spent on the formula and materials had mostly come from a sum his mother slipped him in secret when he was thrown out, and it was no small amount. If he hadn't stumbled onto rumors of supernatural power and managed to get his hands on that formula, Ryan suspected the big idiot wouldn't have held onto that money for long. You had everything going for you. Why become a gambling addict? And look where that got you. You gambled away your own life. If I hadn't ended up here by chance, you'd probably have stayed undiscovered until next month. And even when news of your death does make it back home, who's going to grieve, aside from your mother? So what was the point? Next life, don't be a gambling addict, David John. Author's note: this chapter. How can anyone be this reckless? Who do you think you are, the main character? _EE Jiangsu Big Idiot. Sorry, I actually am. Hebei some author. Well, you are now. Beijing actually not a big deal. By the end of the Fifth Era, the primal will had already weakened enough that even without the secondary ingredients, low-sequence advancements have a chance of succeeding. Reply to 2025-051-3464, you can just skip straight to consuming the supernatural characteristic, just roll the dice. Chapter 3, The Past and the Powers. 1,767 words. Rest easy, you idiot. Don't expect me to do anything for you. I don't owe you a thing. Whatever regrets you're carrying, chalk it up to your own bad luck. You brought this on yourself. From here on out, none of this concerns you anymore. The most I'll promise is that I won't trouble your family. Fine, if it's not too much of a hassle, I might do them one favor. Just one. Don't push it. That said, Ryan added the final customary words of this world spoken aloud, but without any accompanying gesture of prayer. May the Lord of Storms watch over your soul. The big idiot had followed his family's faith, the Lord of Storms, one of the two great beliefs of the ruined kingdom where he'd lived. Not that his faith had been particularly sincere, given how much of it he'd squandered at gambling tables. Hopefully the deity wasn't too put off by that. It was fortunate that no one else witnessed this absurdly barebones funeral, if those few words even qualified as one. Even the father who'd cast his wayward son out might have felt the urge to throw a punch. But Ryan didn't much care. The circumstances were unusual. Unusual circumstances called for unusual measures. Besides, he'd only gotten a little sentimental and said a couple of words. It wasn't a big deal. He had never been the type to show reverence for all the dead. Let alone someone whose choices he couldn't begin to understand even now, even with access to the big idiot's memories. A glance at the guy's build alone told you the family had been well off. The father was strict, certainly, but the decision to expel his own son hadn't come purely from the son gambling his way through university and accomplishing nothing. The real breaking point had been the big idiot beating someone so badly at a gambling den that the man ended up seriously injured, and that man happened to have ties to local people of influence. After spending considerable resources cleaning up that mess, the father's patience finally snapped when the son showed no remorse whatsoever, and the expulsion followed. Adding to that, everyone in the family except the big idiot was a devout follower of the Storm Church. So even though the mother couldn't bear to go along with it, she had no power to override the head of the household. The money she gave her son was handed over in secret, behind her husband's back. Ryan even suspected that money had been borrowed from a close friend. In households that followed the Lord of Storms, wives typically held a subordinate position. Their role was to manage the home for their husbands, with no income of their own. And while the father was undeniably patriarchal, he wasn't unfaithful, and the marriage was by all accounts a stable one. Under those circumstances, a devout Storm Church wife would have had no logical reason to keep private savings. Though of course, this was all speculation on Ryan's part. It was equally possible the father had quietly turned a blind eye, still holding on to a thread of affection for his son. But the big idiot hadn't given any of that a second thought. He'd been thrown out thinking he'd prove himself, find a gambling den, make it big, make the old man regret it. If supernatural power hadn't seemed like an even more satisfying way to be right, Ryan doubted the idiot had the self-control to limit himself to one gambling visit a week and only small bets. Ryan himself, though far from a model citizen, had never been one for crooked shortcuts. They simply weren't worth it. So he couldn't fathom the big idiot's inexplicable confidence in himself, not even with his memories to draw from. Which meant that even taking this idiot's body and inheriting his memories, Ryan felt no obligation to be kind about it. The big idiot hadn't left him with nothing, no skills, no resources, no starting point, so Ryan supposed he could hold back from saying anything truly harsh. Anyway, the dead are gone. Focus on yourself, your own situation still isn't confirmed. He pulled his attention back and turned his focus to sound. The area was already on the eastern outskirts of Moan, a medium-sized, unremarkable city, so aside from a scattering of slow, sleeping breaths in the distance, the only sound was the night wind moving through the grass. Quiet enough to feel peaceful rather than unnerving, especially since the darkness, to him, looked barely different from daylight, just without color. He could even gauge the approximate straight-line distance to each of those sleeping sounds. He shifted his attention to the building in front of him and, without particularly thinking about it, pulled himself up onto the roof, agile in a way that didn't match his frame, and without much effort. Even with the technique helping, he had noticeably more strength than the big idiot had before. Ryan was certain of that. He also noted that the movement, despite its scale, hadn't broken his concealment, and neither did the moonlight, though that might have been because the crimson glow wasn't bright enough. He leaned over to check the distance to the ground. Not terribly high, but Ryan quietly decided to find the lowest eave and sit drop from there, just to be safe. As it turned out, he'd been overcautious. The moment he lost contact with the surface, before he'd even consciously activated the ability, Featherfall had already kicked in as automatic as certain people's mouths, operating without passing through their brains. A body that had to weigh at least 100 kilograms drifted down like a leaf. Ryan didn't know yet what he looked like, but imagining the scene, he had to admit it was a little ridiculous. Good thing he had concealment. As he neared the ground, he tried manually disengaging Featherfall. His descent speed immediately normalized. After landing, he gave a moderate jump. As expected, Featherfall wasn't triggered just by leaving the ground. Makes sense. Otherwise it'd be called Lightfoot. That left full force strike. It consumed spiritual energy to concentrate all of his physical strength into a single attack. But looking at the empty expanse around him, Ryan scratched his head. No stick, no branch. Was he supposed to punch the earth? Find a small stone, he decided after a moment. And while I'm at it, test whether my vision really is as sharp as an eagle's. Throwing a stone was still an attack. Fair enough. By this point in the testing, with the easier-to-verify abilities all checking out, Ryan's anxiety had settled to about half. He was relaxed enough now to start noticing smaller things. Like the fact that he wasn't sneaking or tiptoeing, just walking normally. And yet even with his own augmented hearing, he could only barely make out the grass bending underfoot. No footstep sounds. Not even the rustle of his shoes against the blades. Finding a stone in the dark wasn't difficult with night vision. A few sweeps of his gaze and he had a target. He picked it up and tossed it casually in a direction, then took off at a sprint to follow it. Only as he approached full speed did his form become fully visible and footsteps finally sounded. Even at that pace, he could still clearly track the stone's rotation as it flew through the air. He retrieved the same stone and tried shadow concealment in direct moonlight. Nothing happened. So the shadow cast by the moon isn't enough to work with, even dim moonlight doesn't qualify. Back to the building's shadow and concealed again, he threw the stone with the same force as before. In the instant his wrist snapped forward, something intangible but distinctly his dissolved and his concealment broke simultaneously. The stone launched at a dramatically faster speed, moving too quickly for even his current vision to track. It came to rest absurdly far away, far enough to be almost unreasonable. As if every ounce of his physical strength had been poured into that one small stone. He was a little glad he'd picked something small. If it had been any bigger, he might have woken someone up. Imagining that velocity hitting a person's skull at close range, it felt about like a brick dropped from height. And the more baffling part, his wrist hadn't taken any feedback from the force at all. Full force strike seemed to transfer the power directly to the projectile. Concealment, gravity defiance, enhanced sight and hearing, explosive force that followed no reasonable rules paired with a body that was already remarkably agile. Ryan found himself genuinely surprised by the gap between himself and an ordinary person, and this was from the most common, weakest Sequence 9 potion. He couldn't begin to imagine what a Sequence 1 potion might do. Planetary destruction? Purely conceptual abilities? He wondered idly what sequence you'd have to reach to move freely through space. Somewhere in that reverie, his mind drifted back to a fragment of the big idiot's memory, his first encounter with the man who'd sold him the formula. "Big guy, I hear you've been looking for supernatural power. I happen to have a Sequence 9 formula for the assassin pathway. Want it?" He could feel the rush of excitement and longing that had flooded the big idiot in that moment. It was the same feeling stirring in him now. "I suppose I can call myself a Sequence 9 extraordinary of the assassin pathway." He admitted it, he was a little excited. Whether that excitement came from standing at the threshold of a path laced with supernatural power, or from catching the faintest flicker of something that looked like possibility, he couldn't quite say. Author's note: this chapter: concealment, gravity defiance, enhanced sight and hearing, explosive force beyond all reason paired with remarkable agility. Ryan found himself genuinely surprised by the gap between himself and an ordinary person, and this was from the most common, weakest Sequence 9 potion. Beijing: not exactly invisibility. True invisibility doesn't come until Sequence 7, and you can't do it without materials until Sequence 6. Author reply: the protagonist is just using a more concise and familiar word to describe shadow concealment. It's not meant to be taken as literal invisibility. Chapter 4. Chapter 4: Plans for the Future. 1,353 words. Alright, it's too early to be thinking about all that. The excitement faded, and Ryan felt a little sheepish for getting ahead of himself. Yes, the abilities had come through without error, which strongly suggested the secondary ingredients played a much smaller role than he'd initially feared. But saying they had no effect? He didn't believe that for a second. What exactly they did, and what going wrong with them might cause, that wasn't something he could work out on his own. He'd need to ask someone. Fortunately, the candidate wasn't a problem he had to solve right now. So the dread was still only halfway gone, but that didn't mean he couldn't relax. Right, one thing to note: unlike Featherfall, using full force strike appears to immediately interrupt shadow concealment, even with minimal motion. He filed that away quietly. The first time he'd thrown the stone, he hadn't broken concealment. Turning over the feel of the abilities in his mind, he recalled the sensation of that intangible something being consumed. He pulled a blade of grass, activated full force strike, and flicked it away. The grass didn't survive the force, it shredded into scraps the instant it left his fingers. Still not at the level of those legendary martial artists who channel energy through the air, he thought dryly. But the identical sensation confirmed it wasn't his imagination. That intangible thing was almost certainly the spiritual energy full force strike required. In truth, shadow concealment and Featherfall, the other two that needed active use, also listed spiritual energy as a cost in the manual. But Ryan hadn't noticed it with those. Only full force strike had made him aware of what seemed to be the equivalent of an MP bar. He had zero interest in testing his maximum, though. This wasn't necessarily a game, and draining the bar might not be consequence-free. What if the big idiot's poorly handled potion came back to bite him exactly when the bar ran out? He might be big, but he wasn't stupid. His 3-word rule right now: don't be reckless. Until he found the loophole, stick to what was safe. If his life weren't potentially on the line, he wouldn't even bother looking. So what do I actually do now? Once he'd registered the MP bar's existence, Ryan dropped any thought of further ability testing. Life came first. The only reason he hadn't already set off was that it was the middle of the night, no one to find. The big idiot's memories, for all their gaps, did include a few people who were likely extraordinaries. He had candidates. Just not the right timing. There was nothing to do but wait. So Ryan turned back to the room, intent on collapsing into bed. In the dark, he could see clearly that the bed was on the thin side. He gave up the idea of a proper sprawl and settled for lying down normally. It was about as firm as a university dorm mattress, wide enough, at least. He wasn't picky about comfort. When conditions were good, he was happy to enjoy them, and when they weren't, he didn't let it bother him. He closed his eyes and prepared to rest. It had been a thoroughly eventful night. But apparently he'd overestimated his own calm. He was tired, but sleep wouldn't come. My life looks safe for now. But I still can't figure out why I transmigrated. Even a web novel wouldn't dare write this. He ran back through the details of that day. Unremarkable commute home, perfectly ordinary snack purchase. The only thing different from any other day was passing a street stall and spotting a stone that caught his eye. Something about all the etchings on it made him inexplicably like it. He bought it on a whim. In hindsight, a little suspicious. But he'd only touched it for a moment before setting it aside. And he'd transmigrated while lying in bed hours after buying it. Had it taken that long to charge up? Or was the stone completely unrelated, and he'd just hit an astronomically low probability? Or had some divine entity conscripted him for reasons unknown? And if there was a purpose, what purpose? He was an ordinary office worker. Even to a being powerful enough to transmigrate people at will, he'd barely qualify as cannon fodder. They hadn't even given him a system. What use could he possibly be? Or maybe the outcome wasn't the point, maybe only the act of transmigrating itself mattered. He lay there thinking for a long time and came up with nothing. So eventually he decided to let it go. If it wasn't someone's deliberate doing, letting go changed nothing. If it was, then letting go was even more the right call. Whatever had pulled this off operated at a level beyond even this world's supernatural system, something close to divine, no matter the sequence. He was a person who didn't even know the name of his sequence 8 potion. He had no realistic chance of breaking free of something like that. Better to relax, lie back, and take things as they came. He might not be able to change a thing, but at least he'd be more comfortable. I wonder what things are like on the other side right now. He rolled over. Had the big idiot transmigrated there in his place, a life swap? Or had he simply vanished? Died on the spot? Gone into a coma? He hoped it wasn't the first. The big idiot was a liability. He hoped it wasn't the last either, then he'd be the liability. Either way, the people on the other side were going to be devastated. He wondered if they'd call him ungrateful. His mother had a habit of saying things like, "I spent nearly 20 years raising you, and I'm counting on you to take care of me in my old age." Well, that hope had gone down in flames now. Though Ryan had never understood where that fear of hers came from. He'd never done anything particularly outrageous. His grades were decent, not remarkable. After graduation, he hadn't leached off them or asked them for money. He'd deliberately chosen a city far away to work in and didn't go back except for the Lunar New Year, but he had his reasons, and he'd never said he wasn't coming back at all. And her worry had started back in middle or high school, long before any of that. Their relationship had always been cool at best, and yes, there had been arguments during high school. But none of that had anything to do with whether he was responsible. If it really came down to it, she could take him to court. It wasn't like he'd flee the country over it. He genuinely couldn't figure out what she'd been so afraid of. But even if they did call him ungrateful, it wouldn't really hurt. He hadn't asked to transmigrate. That wasn't on him. Still, after rolling over again, Ryan decided to make an effort. Even setting aside any sense of responsibility for the sake of the games he hadn't finished playing, he ought to at least try. Not lie completely flat. Given the chasm between what he could currently do and the fact of his transmigration, though, he'd start there, with that as his goal. Dreams were worth having. As for the effort, he'd figure out the direction first. Everything else he'd leave to fate. And so, for the first time, this young man who had always drifted with the current and harbored no particular ambitions found himself with a goal distant, but real. Something he actually wanted to work toward. He drifted into his first dream in this foreign world, as the darkness before dawn deepened around him. Author's note: this chapter he still couldn't figure out why he'd transmigrated. Even a web novel wouldn't dare write this. Hune author, are you complimenting yourself? Chapter 5, The Basics, the City and the Churches. 2088 words. Brilliant sunlight poured over the horizon as expected, flooding everything across the land. A new day had arrived. The sky was unusually clear of clouds. It looked like it was going to be a bright, beautiful day. Unfortunately, it wasn't a beautiful morning for Ryan. He woke from sleep with a start, just as he had the night before. The bad news, that sensation of every cell in his body descending into chaos, had returned, along with a faint ache in his arm that set him on edge. The good news: the symptoms were noticeably milder than the night before, nothing approaching the heart-pounding, unbearable intensity of then. The new development: this time there was an indistinct voice murmuring in his ear, repeating over and over, never clear enough to make out. All of it left him profoundly irritable, with a reckless urge to smash something. Fortunately, it passed quickly. Ryan didn't act on the impulse. Good news, I suppose. At least it didn't kill me. He rubbed his temples and waited out the headache that felt like it might split his skull. Perhaps the potion's enhancement of his constitution helped, because the physical discomfort faded quickly. But the irritability, nausea, and low-grade dread lingered, refusing to lift. Looking out at the cheerful sunlight, Ryan pocketed the 7 sous and 3 pence that were the big idiot's only remaining funds, shut the door, and walked out into the sun. The window. In a run-down building like this, on the near-abandoned city outskirts, the window was barely more than a large hole in the wall, too narrow even for a child to squeeze through. Other than being cheap and isolated, this place had no redeeming qualities. Sous and pence were the currencies of the Ruined Kingdom. 1 sou equaled 12 pence. What baffled Ryan was that the larger unit £1 equaled 20 sous. And there were also halfpence and quarterpence denominations. Wait, haven't I seen this somewhere before? A broken currency system, was his assessment. But even in any world, warm sunlight was inherently pleasant, and the weight in his chest lifted a little as he walked into it. If not for that ache from earlier, he'd have been tempted to just stand here for a while. But he had someone to meet, and that person wouldn't be available until afternoon. He ran the underground market for supernatural materials, and that market didn't open until afternoon. Of course, being hungry was also, more immediately, a very important reason to get moving. As he walked, Ryan reviewed what he knew of the city. Moen City, a mid-sized, ordinary city in the western part of Ahawa County, in the northern reaches of the Ruined Kingdom. Situated near the Tassoc River, the kingdom's largest waterway, but far from the more prosperous central and southern regions and subject to a colder climate. Less affluent, accordingly, than the counties to its south. The Ruined Kingdom's second city after the capital Buklund, the university city of Tingen, lay in the southern part of Ahawa County. Given that one of the Ruined Kingdom's 2 great faiths was the Lord of Storms, the King of the Sky, Emperor of the Sea, Master of Calamity, God of Storms, his followers were everywhere. And with the Tassoc River, originating in the Murmansk Mountains to the northwest and emptying into the sea at Pritz Harbor to the southeast, running through the region, river transport was naturally widespread in the Ruined Kingdom. Moen City owed its status as a non-negligible town largely to that river. One of the assassin potion's primary ingredients, root tendrils of the shadow poison flower, had been sourced by the big idiot from the city's underground market. Unlike the Ruined Kingdom's overall east-south rich, west-north poor distribution, Moen's wealthier districts were to the north. That was because the Evernite goddess church's headquarters, the Tranquil Cathedral, was further north, in the Coldwinter County. More specifically, the Northwest District was home to upper-middle-class Storm faithful, given the Tassoc River's proximity to the west. The northeast belonged to followers of the Evernite goddess. The southwest was commonly called the Docklands. The southeast was predominantly working class. The room Ryan rented was on the eastern outskirts. Apparently the area had once been slated for eastward expansion. Several buildings had been constructed that weren't the standard row house type typical for lower-income renters. But the plans fell through, and now the area was severely underserved in terms of infrastructure, with uneven, potholed roads. Many of the buildings had been cobbled together from half-finished construction, making some standalone units worse than the cheapest row houses. The whole district shared a single public washroom facility. As a result, only people with specific needs like Ryan or families on the verge of bankruptcy would choose to rent there. Lost in thought, Ryan suddenly heard a set of wheels on the road surface. Unlike the horse-drawn carriages common in this world, the sound came from 2 wheels positioned front to back, accompanied by the noise of gears and a chain. He looked up. A bicycle, ridden by a middle-aged police officer with a slight paunch, was coming toward him. "They have bicycles?" He was mildly surprised. Digging through his memory confirmed it. They did called pedal vehicles here, and still a fairly new form of transportation. They'd only become popular in the last year or two. Unlike steam-powered vehicles, the large, lumbering machines you only ever saw in newspapers, the pedal vehicle had spread from the capital Berkland to Moen in under 3 years of existence, thanks to being affordable, practical, compact, and not particularly road-sensitive. If not for the war breaking out, the timeline would have been even shorter. Apparently, police departments in southern cities had already begun issuing them to officers to improve response efficiency. This one, though, was probably the officer's personal property. Moen City had only started floating that idea in the first half of this year, and it was currently only October. There was nothing particularly astonishing about any of this. Even the big idiot, whose grasp of history was minimal at best, knew that nearly 200 years ago, the Republic of Intis to the west of the ruined kingdom had undergone an industrial revolution comparable to early modern Britain, kicked off by the then consul Rossel, later known as Rossel the Great, a figure whose legacy remained a touchstone of fascination across nations. Other countries had followed suit only about 20 years behind. So bicycles, in this context, made sense probably. Ryan wasn't confident enough in his own historical knowledge to say for certain. His accurate recall of specific dates was limited to a handful of major events. He stepped off the path as the officer drew near. Police in this era weren't necessarily civil or restrained, especially toward the poor. Out here, there was only one reason for police to visit: to drive out the homeless who couldn't afford rent. Even public parks saw officers chasing away vagrants. This was private land, technically, and the Moen city government still held ownership despite the area's near abandonment. He wasn't afraid of trouble. He didn't exactly look approachable right now, but avoiding unnecessary complications was sensible. Because in this world, the churches exercised extremely strict control over anything connected to the supernatural. How strict? The big idiot's own experience offered a concrete example. The formula had been in his hands for roughly 3 years. Yet for about the first year, he'd made zero progress on sourcing the supernatural ingredients. He'd come close to abandoning the whole thing, and if a war hadn't broken out during that period to occupy his mind with something other than gambling, he probably never would have gathered everything. The war, in October of year 1350, the Forsaken Empire to the north had launched an airship bombing raid on the ruined kingdom's capital, Berkland. The ruined kingdom had declared war immediately. Over time, it escalated into a continent-wide conflict, drawing in all 4 major powers of the northern continent and several smaller nations, only to end abruptly in September of 1351, so suddenly that even the ruined kingdom initially had no idea why they'd won. The church's loosening grip on supernatural-related matters wasn't solely because the war had diverted their attention. It was also because the war itself had, for what seemed to be the first time since the Fifth Era the Iron Age produced mass, witnessed supernatural phenomena in front of ordinary soldiers. After the war ended, reports of strange and disturbing occurrences continued to surface across the continent. The church's official explanation: this had been a divine war. The inexplicable events during the conflict were manifestations of divine power. The abrupt end was the result of one side prevailing over the other in a contest between gods. This explanation didn't hold water for anyone who already knew the supernatural existed, nor for those who'd come into contact with it during the war. But it was more than sufficient to reassure the general population. And the big idiot had indeed been galvanized by the war's strangeness enough to keep chasing his materials, eventually gathering everything in the year since the war ended. And then dying on the spot, Ryan mentally added. One more detail worth noting: in a world where the undead, water spirits, and centuries-old popes were simply accepted facts of life, most people still believed the supernatural was the stuff of legend. The reason followed the same logic: the bad was always attributed to evil gods, demons, or other malevolent beings, while the good was divine providence. The undead, for instance, were widely believed to result from the fall of the death god, a malevolent deity whose collapse at the end of the Fourth Era, the Era of Gods, had also ended the pale calamity that had swept the northern continent. His fall and the calamity's end marked the transition from the Era of Gods to the Iron Age. An extraordinary discovered by the churches would almost certainly be flagged as an unstable element. Best case, placed under surveillance, barred from leaving the city without permission. Disappearances were not uncommon. Rumors about churches conducting grim experiments on captured extraordinaries appeared in over a dozen non-overlapping versions in the Big Idiot's memories alone. It had only been a year since the war ended, and already the streets held almost no whisper of those strange events. The church's reach was unmistakable. Besides, it was now October of year 1352 of the Iron Age. Throughout the Iron Age's entire history, though conflicts and occasional wars had flared between the northern continent's major powers, and though each nation had its own internal turbulence, there had never been a total collapse of order or regime change. The church's stability was self-evident. Even if Ryan felt genuinely capable right now, he intended to stay low and careful. Only a fool would take on risks that were potentially catastrophic for gains that weren't guaranteed. But then if the risks were more manageable, would his calculus change? He thought about it. Probably not much. Broadly speaking, maintaining stability and peace was almost always a net positive. He had trouble imagining what level of dysfunction would outweigh the damage of open conflict to ordinary people. And yes, when too many competing interests were at stake, violence had a way of becoming unavoidable, but he didn't think every use of force was wrong. Sometimes the short, sharp solution was better than the prolonged one. On a smaller scale, picking on someone weaker than you had always struck him as one of life's most pointless activities. He wasn't the type who thought dying in a fight with someone stronger would be worth it. That kind of thinking struck him as unhinged, but a fight where both sides were evenly matched. Now that was interesting. PvP was only fun when the skill gap was close enough to show off. Author's note: this chapter, an extraordinary discovered by the churches, would almost certainly be flagged as an unstable element. Best case, placed under surveillance, barred from leaving the city without permission. Disappearances were not uncommon. Rumors about churches conducting grim experiments on captured extraordinaries appeared in over a dozen non-overlapping versions in the Big Idiot's memories alone. Shandong not that charitable. Chapter 6, First Meal in a New World. 1,409 words. I'm starving. Food first. Of the few things in life that one should never pick a fight with, the stomach was unquestionably at the top of the list. Ryan picked up his pace without a second thought and pushed everything else aside for now. As for what to eat, easy, whatever was cheapest. The Big Idiot had no steady income. The formula and ingredients had been funded almost entirely by the £300 his mother had given him and the interest it accrued in the bank. Everything else, daily living expenses, had been scraped together through odd jobs that leveraged his size. Which meant the 7 sous and 3 pence in his pocket was essentially his entire net worth. Honestly, the Big Idiot had gotten lucky. Under normal circumstances, £300 would barely cover 2 primary sequence 9 ingredients. The bargain he'd stumbled into was no small one. Given the morning's unsettling start, Ryan had no hesitation he'd be economical. Like the Big Idiot, he'd keep breakfast to a single pence. Kid was stubborn, I'll give him that. He'd come from a genuinely comfortable family, but managed to live like someone near the poverty line for 3 years straight, all for the chance at supernatural power. Going from luxury to austerity and holding there was admirable, for a gambler especially. Another 10 or so minutes of walking, and the city's buildings came into view along with scattered clusters of people. I never expected to see a color photograph of early modern Britain in this lifetime. What stretched before him called to mind the photographs from history textbooks. The overall style and impression were remarkably close. The details, though, he couldn't say. He only had a vague memory of those images. As for architectural styles, he only had 2 categories in his head: familiar and foreign. Anything he didn't recognize fell into the latter. What he could say with certainty was that the people on the street were nothing like anyone in those old photographs. Put any of them in his world and they'd be mistaken for beggars on sight. Though he was in no position to judge, he looked the same, in worn, heavily mended old clothes. His only edge over the people around him was being slightly cleaner. The Big Idiot had washed up just the previous midday. This world had its own version of the belief that a clean body was more likely to attract the favor of the divine or of fate. And even so, these weren't the worst off in the city. This stretch sat at the transition between the northwest and southwest districts, where law and order were reasonably maintained. Most people here had some modest savings, at least enough that going hungry was unlikely. The route to the breakfast stall was one of the big idiot's clearer memories. So despite the fragmented state of things, Ryan found the familiar shop without a single wrong turn. "Hey, big fella. Early today the usual?" The greeting came before he'd even reached the counter. Ryan took in the slightly stooped but cheerful middle-aged owner and shook his head. "Not today. Stomach's off, just one rye loaf." He handed over a pence and didn't linger. The big idiot had never been a talker here either. A year of daily breakfasts at this stall, and neither of them knew the other's name. Ryan saw no reason to suddenly be different. Rye bread was the staple of the poor in this part of the world. Each loaf was about £0.5, 2 for a pence cheap, filling, and it kept well. Left dry, it could double as a blunt weapon in a pinch. Its only real drawback was taste. But Ryan had underestimated the owner's warmth. The man paused mid-reach for the bread when he heard the order. "Stomach troubles? Will it affect your work? Big fella, you've got to watch yourself. This isn't the South. Winter doesn't bring as many jobs. If you're laid up now, winter's going to be rough. We lose a few people to cold out here every year." Ryan could see the speech wasn't stopping anytime soon. He accepted the bread and cut in gently. I'm all right. Just not much appetite. Starting with one to see how it goes." "Oh right. Good to hear. Didn't mean anything bad by it." The owner let out a relieved breath and hurried to add the reassurance. "Do I look that intimidating?" Ryan suddenly found himself genuinely curious what this face looked like. "I know. You were just looking out for me." He smiled, settled the exchange, took a seat with his loaf. The owner retreated to the back to fetch hot water, privately wondering if the big fella had come into some money. He seemed oddly pleasant today. Ryan hefted the club in his hand. £0.5 sounded about right. The big idiot had eaten at least 2 of these per breakfast, and on hungrier days, went down without a fight. He took a bite. Yep. A serviceable weapon. He resigned himself to waiting for the hot water. Hot water was part of the stall's appeal. A free bowl came with every bread purchase, and refills cost 1/4 pence each. Since the buildings in his part of the city had no way to boil water without improvising, storing bread and eating it cold was out of the question. Whatever income this policy generated for the owner, it had certainly built him a reputation. "Here's your water, big fella." Ryan nodded and began his first meal in this new world. The texture wasn't as bad as he'd expected. Not good, but not miserable either. He wasn't a picky eater. Comfort was nice when available. When it wasn't, he didn't dwell on it. He chewed and thought, what do I do with the morning? Figure out how to make money. Or learn more about this world. The morning's episode had been unpleasant, but it hadn't felt like something that would kill him without warning, so seeking out an extraordinary immediately didn't seem urgent enough to justify the risk of a wasted trip. And money-making wasn't a puzzle he needed to crack right this moment. The big idiot's only real assets were his body and his new supernatural abilities, and with the need for discretion, there wasn't much margin to maneuver. Doing it now versus later made little practical difference. So, go read something. The big idiot had attended university, but had clearly been a terrible student. Whatever he'd learned had been returned to his professors long ago, and only fragments remained now. Even things that should have been second nature were unreliable. He couldn't even pull up with confidence something as basic as how many days were in a year. And yet the sharpest thing in the big idiot's remaining memories was a collection of Russell the Great's romantic escapades. Truly remarkable priorities. But for someone who'd arrived from another world entirely, understanding this one as well as possible could only help. Things that this world's people took for granted might carry entirely different meanings to him. Even without supernatural powers and without the divine war, he could say with some confidence that gods existed in this world. Nations here had remained stable and continuous for over 1,300 years. What else could account for that? Furthermore, the churches actively encouraged broad learning, not just religious study. They'd even established free schools for children who couldn't afford tuition, where the religious content was minimal and the focus was on basic literacy. That tradition had been sustained through an entire industrial revolution, nearly 2 centuries. The confidence that came from having divine backing was clear. Looking at it that way, a world with gods wasn't entirely a bad arrangement. Faith didn't have to be a cage for the mind, and religion didn't have to obstruct science. If he'd been born a few centuries earlier, without the context of something better, he suspected he might genuinely have envied it. His mind wandered a little further. 1,000 years of peace and livable conditions. That's not nothing. Author's note: this chapter, do I look that intimidating? Ryan suddenly found himself genuinely curious what this face looked like. Hewn does the protagonist's appearance have a reference? Chapter 7. Chapter 7a Transmigrator from 200 years ago. 1,136 words. Another loaf, please. Coming right up. Thinking didn't slow him down. He finished the first one and wanted a second. Since the big idiot had been eating here morning and evening for a year, the owner refilled his hot water for free while fetching the bread. Halfway through the second loaf, Ryan suddenly registered something. He hadn't found the food off-putting. Was that because he was in a different body? Or too early to tell after just one meal? No study abroad experience to draw on, so he filed the question away and finished the rest. He waved farewell to the owner on the way out. He was reasonably satisfied, though not full, but he wasn't planning to do any physical labor, so he didn't bother with a third. Nowadays, labor meant survival wages and nothing more. It wasn't a symbol of dignity, it was a symbol of having no better option. Only those with no other path spent their time on work with no visible future. Both worlds were the same on that front. Which meant this world's gods didn't love people quite as much as they claimed. Indifference, or inability. And what had they built the churches for faith? What did belief actually give a god? There was also something strange about the political structure. With divine power backing them, the churches could easily run a theocracy. It would have been completely feasible. And yet all four major powers on the northern continent had kings and royal families. Not just nominally, they held real authority. Unlike the Pope, who could hold the position for centuries. The churches clearly influenced national leadership, but they didn't hold power directly. It seemed redundant. The royal families didn't appear to have any divine backing of their own, so a clash between royal and divine authority seemed off the table. Was it an act of goodwill? Or deliberate to keep the churches from becoming bureaucratic? Though if no conflict existed between the two, there was another possibility: a division of labor. Churches handled the supernatural, royalty managed secular affairs. That made sense on the surface, but then the church's stringent control over supernatural power needed a more compelling explanation than simply maintaining order. There was a deliberate effort to keep the supernatural out of the awareness of most people, and he couldn't figure out why. Unless knowing about the supernatural somehow raised the chances of some great malevolent entity's revival. He made a note to pay attention to the relationship between the royal families and the churches to see whether any of his guesses held up. This is more interesting than figuring out how to make money. So without hesitation, Ryan changed direction and headed for the city center library. Building churches, spreading faith, keeping order, running charitable institutions, but not consolidating power for themselves in the process. The gods, by all appearances, wanted something that power and wealth couldn't simply purchase. Because in a world with supernatural force, divine power was the ultimate expression of power and wealth. But what, concretely, did faith give the gods? As a reader of web fiction, he could think of several possibilities, none of which he could immediately verify. The big idiot's memories did offer one other lead, though. In the Republic of Intis to the west of the Ruined Kingdom, one of the two great faiths, the god of steam and machinery, had issued a divine decree during Rossel the Great's reign, changing its own name from the former god of craftsmen. The decree was said to be closely connected to something Rossel had done, and it remained one of the most discussed aspects of his legacy. Unfortunately, the big idiot remembered this only because the decree itself had been so stunning. What Rossel had actually done to prompt it was nowhere in his memory. Picking through carefully, Ryan pieced together what the big idiot did retain. Rossel had invented many things, left behind many famous sayings, overthrown the Intisian kingdom, established the Republic of Intis, and served as its first consul. He later declared himself Caesar the Great, converted the Republic into an empire, and died in old age from an assassination. Everything else was fairly unremarkable, but Caesar the Great gave Ryan a jolt. His history wasn't thorough, but he knew who Caesar was. Different language, similar circumstances, and sound. This was no coincidence. And if it wasn't, then his own transmigration was beginning to feel quietly alarming. One transmigrator might be written off as random misfortune. Two or more were a pattern. Calling it chance at that point was self-deception. I knew books were useful, but this useful? He frowned and held back a sharp intake of breath. The implication was genuinely unsettling. But rattled as he was, he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen it. Better to understand it clearly than remain in comfortable ignorance. He quickened his pace toward the library. His current appearance was, admittedly, not ideal for a library visit. Library-goers tended toward the middle class, at minimum neat and presentable, if not extravagant. In his current clothes, he'd draw attention. But Ryan hadn't been about to buy an outfit just for a library trip, and now he had even less interest in that. As for the mockery or obstruction that might follow, so long as you were shameless enough and in the right, what could anyone actually do? He'd never been afraid of an argument, and right now he didn't even need to worry about someone losing their temper and swinging at him. He genuinely doubted that in a world where the churches encouraged learning, anyone would dare post a no entry for the poor sign on a public library door. This was a capitalist world, yes, but it was also a world where supernatural power existed, and where divine authority outranked everything, including capital. His behavior wouldn't risk violating some unspoken rule and causing a scene. He wasn't looking for trouble. What he had was simply respect for the institution, a structure that had stood on this earth for at least 1,352 years. For anyone here, it was ordinary. For him, miracle wasn't too strong a word. But that respect didn't mean he would be cowed. As long as exposing himself as an extraordinary wasn't a risk, he'd rather step into things and see what happened. Watch the spectacle. And even if he'd read the situation wrong, the fix was simple: back down before it escalated. He wouldn't find that humiliating. He'd just conclude that this country and its churches had nothing worth respecting beyond raw force. Author's note: this chapter, unless knowing about the supernatural somehow raised the chances of some great malevolent entity's revival. Chapter 8. Chapter 8: A Strange Transmigration. 1,254 words. Taking a carriage from the western edge of the city to the library would have been faster, but Ryan had wanted to test his post-potion stamina, so he ran. The manual only noted that the potion significantly enhanced agility and general physical conditioning. How much, exactly, required testing? He mentally added a watch to his shopping list, then started his first run as an extraordinary. It was actually enjoyable. At a pace that would have seemed fast to most people, he was merely jogging, and 10 minutes in, he didn't feel tired in the slightest. The cold wind was the only thing keeping it from being ideal. The big idiot had a naturally strong frame but no dedicated training to speak of. So hitting this kind of result on the first run made Ryan genuinely curious. If an agility-focused potion produced this, how extreme would a strength-focused one be? Not tired, but still sensible. He slowed down to look winded, then sped back up after a bit. Rinse and repeat, factoring in getting lost. After a good half hour or more, he arrived in front of the library and glanced at the clock tower in the adjacent square. 1 second here matched 1 second back home. The week also had 7 days. Monthly and annual lengths, though, were things the big idiot hadn't retained. Ryan walked straight in. If not for passing pedestrians swerving away from him, possibly worried about illness, he would have zigzagged through the crowd on the way in just for the fun of it. Minor nuisances required small repayments. Inside, modest in size, which made sense, this was a government-funded public library, not one of the private establishments that catered to nobility and the wealthy. Books were still relatively valuable here. Without a lending card, you could read on the premises but not take anything home. Getting a lending card was, for Ryan, not currently realistic. He picked someone who looked like staff and headed over. The young man took a startled step back before Ryan even reached him. He nearly laughed. "What are you afraid of? Even if I were robbing someone, would I rob a library? Don't worry, I'm just here to read." Since it was a weekday and the library was nearly empty, Ryan's reassurance came out at full volume. A quiet public reprimand. "I'm sorry, sir. You're just very impressively built." The young librarian looked away in embarrassment. No worries. Could you point me to anything on Rossel the Great? That way. Even clocking the state of Ryan's clothes, the young man only hesitated briefly before pointing. Thank you. Sir, if you don't have a lending card, you won't be able to take anything out. Understood. And these books are fragile, please handle them carefully. Damage will incur a fine. Understood. Already walking, Ryan answered without turning around, leaving the librarian staring at his back and wondering if any of it had actually landed. A short distance later, he found what he was looking for. He scanned the spines. Selected poems of Rossel, a treasury of aphorisms. Rossel the Great, the legend of an emperor, the greatest genius, Rossel the Great's inventions, Rossel the Great's love life, the secret source of his endless creativity. There's quite a collection. Dozens of volumes, all with Rossel's name in the title. Poetry, entertainment, culture, inventions, politics, and apparently distinguished contributions in each. And come to think of it, the big idiot had once spotted someone selling Rossel's notebooks while sourcing materials. He'd been so fixated on the ingredients that he hadn't given it a glance. Had the great emperor also made significant inroads into the supernatural? Ryan pulled out selected poems of Rossel and flipped through a few pages, then quietly returned it. Right. This world used an alphabetic script. He had no way of detecting plagiarism. He barely remembered a handful of classical Chinese poems, let alone foreign ones. He pulled out the biography instead and read quickly. Born a son of impoverished nobility. Made his fortune through invention. Created the steam engine and improved sailing vessels, hailed as the son of steam. Exploited the weakened state of the Intisian kingdom's ruling Soren family after military setbacks, incited revolution, overthrew the monarchy, established the Republic of Intis, and became its first consul. Promulgated a civil code. Protected intellectual invention. Launched the Industrial Revolution. Conquered surrounding nations and forced the other major powers of the northern continent to submit, then converted the Republic to an empire and declared himself Caesar the Great. Dispatched fleets through the storms and treacherous currents of the raging sea to find a passage to the southern continent, opening the age of colonization. In his old age, assassinated by a coalition of nobles at the White Maple Palace. Born in 1125, fell at the White Maple Palace in 1198. From the moment he was named Son of Steam, Intis had risen on his achievements and declined in the wake of his death. But what shocked Ryan far more than any of that was seeing the card games and toys attributed to the man. Tarot cards. A bluffing card game. Texas-style poker. Gwent. Intisian chess. Building blocks. The names weren't exact translations, but the illustrations left no room for doubt these were things from his world. And Rossel was a transmigrator from the same country as him, even. One of the illustrations showed a page from Rossel's notes written in private symbols, blurry, but recognizable, simplified Chinese characters. Ryan leaned against the shelf, frowning in thought. 2 data points. The probability of coincidence had effectively collapsed. This was deliberate. But something didn't fit. Given the things Rossel had brought with him, those games, those inventions, there shouldn't be a gap of 200 years between them. And yet in this world, that gap was real and nearly exact. Why? One possibility, Rossel had been sent back in time. Maybe the timing wasn't entirely controllable. Or maybe whoever was responsible for this was less skilled practicing, perhaps, with multiple transmigrators to refine the process. Or there was some other mechanism at play that Ryan simply didn't understand. That was a logical explanation. But it was only one. Because there was another possibility just as plausible. What if transmigration had nothing to do with time, only space? What if the orchestrator couldn't send someone into the past? What if it wasn't Rossel who went back, but Ryan who'd been sent forward? That would be easier to achieve. Just interrupt the process mid-transit and delay the final step by 200 years. Easy. Stay calm. Ryan took a slow breath and smoothed his expression. At least Rossel left a legacy. Maybe whoever did this isn't all-powerful, maybe they're not fully in control. Or maybe they simply didn't care. But speculation and fear wouldn't get him anywhere. Whatever this turned out to be, good or bad, he probably couldn't dodge it. So he'd face it carefully. And who knows? Maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked. Author's note: this chapter Rossel the Great's love life, the secret source of his endless creativity. Tianjin the witch's taste must be something else. The fallen mother goddess must be something else. Hewn is the love story revealed this early. Author reply: that refers to the romantic history ordinary Intisians would know about, not anything involving the witch. Chapter 9. Chapter 9 Gods and the Supernatural. 1286 words. A long exhale. Ryan shook his head, pushing down the tangled speculation and unease. He skimmed the remaining books in the section. None of them contained Rossel's notebooks or anything else that might tell him more about the man's actual inner life and experiences. Nearly 200 years was a long time. People remembered the legend, a remarkable life, an undeniable legacy. Who he really was, what he truly thought, what he silently carried, posterity rarely found that interesting. Which makes me wonder why anyone would bother chasing posthumous fame. Even if you achieved it, what survived you was your name, your deeds, some fragments, and other people's projections. What persisted in the record wasn't you. A few lines of text at most. He could respect the impulse, but understanding it was something else. He snapped the last book shut and exhaled. The poetry was beyond his judgment, but the inventions, every single one, was plagiarized wholesale, without modification. If the man had contributed even one genuinely original thing, Ryan could have offered a little more respect. He hoped there was no equivalent of an afterlife or a hall of heroes in this world. Because if there was, Rossel had some serious accounting to do. Let's hope whoever's up there goes easy on him. Given that he was spreading their world's genius to this one, maybe they won't swing too hard. The Rossel notebooks clearly had something to do with the supernatural. With this many books devoted to the man, only the biography had mentioned them in passing. The one illustration was too blurry to make out the content, only the script. He'd keep his eyes open going forward. Having confirmed there was nothing more worth reading in that section, he turned and went to pursue his original goal, learning more about this world and its churches. After returning a brief history of ruin to the shelf, Ryan had confirmed his guess. The royal family and the churches were not two sides of the same coin. The Ruan royal house, the Augustus family, had a long history predating the Iron Age. There had been real friction and conflict between them and the churches. And since Rossel had managed to overthrow the Sauron dynasty and establish a republic, political separation from the church was clearly not unique to Ruan. It was simply the approach used to bring those royal families into the fold. In return, the royals offered faith and other concessions in exchange for divine protection. If that was the case, the gods viewed these royal houses as useful, worth cultivating, but not commanding. Which suggested that the gap between the gods and these dynasties was real but not unbridgeable. Sufficiently powerful extraordinaries might approach the level of gods, or more precisely, the gods themselves might simply be extraordinaries who had become powerful enough. And the reason for drawing in the royal families might partly be to keep tabs on them to prevent new gods from emerging. The sequence numbers surfaced in his mind. Even sitting here with both the Night Revelations and the Book of Storms, the sacred texts of the two great churches, in hand, he found himself wondering whether the gods corresponded to sequence 1. He found a seat and settled in, narrowing his eyes. If the rumors in the Big Idiot's fragments were accurate, the Storm Church's punishment vessels, as the church's extraordinaries were designated, were formidable in water, making escape by sea from a punishment vessel extremely difficult. The Church of the Evernite Goddesses, Watchers of the Night, were strongest in the dark, which was why occult trading in their districts typically happened in the afternoon, the one time of day watchers were most inattentive. And the Evernite Goddess's full title, as Ryan found it in the Night Revelations. She is the Evernite Goddess, more sublime than the starry sky, more enduring than eternity, mistress of night, mother of secrets, empress of doom and fear, lady of sleep and silence. Not coincidental. The distinct characteristics of each church's potions seemed to correspond directly to aspects of their deity's honorific names. The titles, as glossed in the texts, described the scope of each deity's power. For instance, the Evernite goddess could bring misfortune or avert it, but couldn't disperse a storm at sea or strike down a heretic with lightning. The Lord of Storms was the reverse. In other words, the gods of this world were not omnipotent. A practical note the texts offered: a deity's full title could not be mispronounced during prayer. This was both an act of sacrilege and a potential means of attracting the attention of evil gods or unknown hidden entities, resulting in a swift and violent death. And if each deity had a defined domain that aligned neatly with different types of potions conferring different forms of supernatural power. The formula seller had mentioned pathway only once, without elaboration, and the big idiot hadn't asked. Ryan was still using a type of potion as shorthand for a sequence 9 potion and all its corresponding sequence 8 through sequence 1 successors. The more he turned it over, the more convinced he became. Perhaps the deity's full title was, at its core, a summation of all the supernatural abilities granted from sequence 9 down to sequence 1. Which would mean that the so-called evil gods and hidden entities in this world were, at root, extraordinarily strong enough, perhaps, to answer prayers the way the recognized gods could. Not necessarily evil or monstrous in nature. Simply beings that the established gods didn't want to see gain a following, so they'd been branded as dangerous, their reputations systematically blackened, their believers discouraged. What made the recognized gods unique was this: no matter where you were, if you spoke their full title, they might answer. Though for an ordinary believer, a response might not come even once in a lifetime. He made a note of it. Worth quietly gathering more specific information about the church's extraordinaries when the opportunity arose. With that filed away, Ryan opened both sacred texts and read. The contents were about what he expected: wall-to-wall praise for each deity, along with each church's teachings, the account of their god's deeds and domain, and the names and stories of their god's servants, generally angels or saints. Unlike the deities themselves, these servants were each assigned to a specific cathedral and jurisdiction. Praying outside that jurisdiction accomplished nothing. I imagine quite a few of these so-called evil gods and hidden entities are probably on about the same level as these saints and angels. The only difference is that they never found a patron, never got put on the official roster. That's rough. Though given that the angels and saints titles had some resemblance to honorific names, just less imposing, the main reason those unaffiliated beings never made the roster was probably less about effort and more about the recognized gods not accepting extraordinaries from other lineages. Even rougher. A beat later, he realized, his own assassin potion didn't appear to belong to any of the recognized church lineages. Which put him squarely in the same category, probably under some evil god or hidden entity, and without so much as a place on the roster. I think I might actually have it worse. Author's note: this chapter, nearly 200 years, was a long time. People remembered the legend, a remarkable life, an undeniable legacy. Who he really was, what he truly thought, what he silently carried, posterity rarely found that interesting. Chapter 10. Chapter 10: Mythology and a Changing Honorific Names. 1,499 words. Alright. Let me think about something more pleasant. After a moment of silence, Ryan set aside the more distant anxieties. He hadn't even figured out his sequence 8 yet. There was nothing to be gained from worrying about things that far ahead. So, the entertainment value in the sacred texts. The Creator awoke from the primordial chaos, shattered the darkness, and called forth the first light. Then the Creator dissolved entirely into the cosmos, becoming all things. Its body became the earth. Part of its blood rushed forth as seas and rivers, nourishing and giving rise to life. One of its eyes blazed into light, from which the eternal blazing sun awakened. The other scattered into stars, within which the ever-night goddess slumbers. Its breath became lightning and tempest, from which the Lord of Storms was born. Its lungs gave rise to the elves, its heart to the giants. The impure portions of its body became demons, evil spirits, and various unknown malevolent entities. The spirit representing exploration was the first to transform, becoming the god of knowledge and wisdom. The spirit representing resilience nurtured the god of war. The spirit representing compassion gave rise to the Earth Mother Goddess. Humanity was born from the Creator's wisdom, while its knowledge became the god of steam and machinery, hidden within truth, awaiting discovery. This is the first era, the primordial age of chaos. This was the sacred text's account of creation and the first era. All he could say was, familiar, unoriginal, and could they have gone bigger? This was a world with actual gods. The most entertaining part was the second passage. Elves, giants, treefolk, dragons, feathered serpents, phoenixes, demon wolves, abominations, sea creatures, noggers, demons, and evil spirits. Each of the supernatural races that appeared in myth and legend corresponded to one of the creator's organs. The scene this conjured, every creature neatly assigned to a body part in orderly succession, was the kind of thing you'd expect from a children's game, not a divine origin story. Whoever had written it must have struggled to keep a straight face. What made it more striking was that both churches' records aligned closely on this point, which almost certainly meant representatives of all 7 churches had once sat down together and composed it jointly. The fact that 7 church factions had managed to cooperate in producing this without internal conflict, and it had held for 1,352 years, said something about their coordination. These races formed the core of humanity's struggle during the Second Era, the Age of Darkness, even with the eternal blazing sun, the Lord of Storms, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom offering protection. The texts managed to describe all of this without casting the other races in an explicitly negative light, which showed more restraint than expected. The situation only began to improve at the end of the Second Era, when the God of War, the Earth Mother Goddess, and the Evernite Goddess awakened. Their awakening marked the end of the Age of Darkness. Then all 6 deities together guided humanity through the cataclysms of the Third Era, commonly known as the Age of Calamity. Ryan had been reading with a faint, sardonic smile right up until he reached something in the Night Revelations that wasn't in the Book of Storms. In the final period of the Age of Darkness, the Earth Mother Goddess had offered assistance to the Evernite Goddess, enabling the latter to awaken earlier than she otherwise would have. In gratitude, the Evernite Goddess presented the Earth Mother Goddess with the most resplendent jewel of the night sky, the crimson moon. Ryan thought about this for a while, then traced through the big idiot's memories until he found what had struck him as wrong. The big idiot hadn't been a devout storm worshipper, but he'd been around enough followers of the night goddess to know their prayer gesture, and it was the crimson moon. He also dimly remembered that the Evernite goddess had once held the honorific names Lady of Crimson. Honorific names can change? This was different from God of Craftsmen becoming God of Steam and Machinery. Terms like Evernite Goddess and Lord of Storms appeared in the sacred texts, but they were shorthands for the faithful. The actual honorific names were long and unwieldy, so abbreviations made sense. But those abbreviations didn't encode divine power the way the full titles did. Swapping Lady of Crimson for Mistress of Night was an entirely different matter. When did the title change? He flipped to the publication date of the Night Revelations, December 1351. Shortly after the end of the Divine War that began 2 years ago. Worth noting, during that war, the southern Fainport Kingdom and its god of Earth Mother had not attacked Ruin from the start, but had quickly turned on Lenberg, a small nation allied to Ruin that followed the god of knowledge and wisdom. In the war's later stages, Fainport had declared war on Ruin directly, joining a 3-nation coalition that launched an invasion. Against that backdrop, this footnote, a brief addition, not part of the main text, easy to miss, felt peculiar. Combined with the fact that the war had ended abruptly with the defeat of the Forsaken Empire and the Church of the Storm God, shortly after Fainport declared on Ruin, and taking into account the well-known enmity between the Church of the Evernite Goddess and the Church of the War God that even the big idiot, a storm follower, had heard about, Ryan strongly suspected that whatever the war god of the Forsaken Empire had suffered in this conflict went far beyond a simple battlefield defeat. Incidentally, the 7 gods of the northern continent had coexisted for 1,352 years without open conflict, but that didn't mean they were friendly. The rift between the Church of the Evernite Goddess and the War God's Church ran deep. The Storm Church and the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, as well as Intiz's Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun, were outright hostile. All of this was common knowledge. Rumor had it that the Church of the Evernite Goddess's headquarters, the Tranquil Cathedral, was established in Coldwinter County, the northernmost county of Ruin, precisely because the Ruin Forsaken Empire border lay just to the north. If the Earth Mother Goddess had simply been opportunistically joining the stronger side, the Church of the Evernite Goddess would have had no need to add a footnote. So Ryan was more inclined to read it as a transaction. What would be worth the goddess trading away Lady of Crimson as a honorific names? Obviously, something better. He nodded slowly, feeling like he was beginning to understand why such clear divisions existed between the churches. This was why keeping up with current events and reading broadly was useful. He filed the inference away and turned back to the sacred text's account of history. There was plenty to question, but even the most manipulated historical record was never entirely false. The same held here texts devoted to praising their own gods still weren't pure fabrication. Wholesale invention was more work and more easily exposed. For instance, the three gods struggling during the Second Era was relatively credible, regardless of whether protecting humanity was the actual reason. They wouldn't have invented their own difficulties just to elevate the other three. Similarly, the claim that the god of war, Earth Mother Goddess, an Evernite goddess only awakened at the end of the Age of Darkness. This didn't necessarily mean they became gods at that point, but it was safe to say they'd had no meaningful presence in the Age of Darkness. Otherwise, the texts would have found a way to mention it. Beyond that, certainty was harder to come by. Why the six prevailed, and why they chose to protect humanity, the most reasonable inference was the faith humans provided, given that both texts noted the violent, bloodthirsty nature of the other races during the Age of Darkness, which would have made them poor candidates for worship. But whether this was the actual reason, or a cover story concealing something more significant, was impossible to confirm from the text alone. You could see only so much. But more than nothing, at least. Author's note: this chapter the creator awoke from the primordial chaos, shattered the darkness, and called forth the first light. Then the creator dissolved entirely into the cosmos, becoming all things. Its body became the earth. Part of its blood rushed forth as seas and rivers, nourishing and giving rise to life. One of its eyes blazed into light, from which the eternal blazing sun awakened. The other scattered into stars, within which the Evernite goddess slumbers. Its breath became lightning and tempest, from which the Lord of Storms was born. Lord of the Mysteries, the Witch's Fate. 1986 words. Web novel. Above the Sapphira Castle, within the Divine Kingdom. A divine war that determined the fate of the entire world quietly drew to a close. The last victor, a truly great existence worthy of the name the Fool, Klein, raised his head toward the dark teal gate of light that represented the Sapphira Castle itself, where transparent cocoons hung suspended one by one. Each cocoon contained a life forcibly frozen in time, just as his own once had been. After a brief moment of connection, Klein closed his fingers. All the cocoons shattered at once. Those wrapped inside dissolved into points of light and flew out of the Sapphira Castle, falling toward people who had just died in the real world, beginning their thoroughly transformed lives anew. But Klein, plagued by the awakening will of the celestial worthy, had no energy to notice the joke fate had played. Some people's lives were better off not continuing. PS1. All world building and settings in this story originate from Lord of the Mysteries by Cuttlefish That Loves Diving. Readers interested in those settings are welcome to check out that completed work. Those who haven't read it need not worry, neither has the protagonist. I promise to explain everything clearly. PS2, genderbender element appears after the opening, not at the beginning. No solo content in later chapters. Read at your own discretion. PSMC name is Shwegang. Change it to Ryan. Later on in the story he will have a female name. Title: Mysteries, The Witch's Fate. Author: Raw. Link: https://1ku.red.qq.com. Detail: 1056841936. Source equals m_jump. Chapter 1 Transmigration. Ryan jolted awake from a deep sleep, shooting upright and gasping for breath. He couldn't remember why, but an overwhelming sense of dread and terror had been seared deep into his soul. With no time for him to catch his breath, a dense, crawling pain spread across his arm. He looked down instinctively and froze in horror. Scale-like patches, resembling fish or snake scales, were burrowing into his flesh. Countless scales writhed and twisted like living things, drilling into his arm one after another. What the hell? Ryan reflexively flung both arms outward. It was pure instinct. He didn't actually expect it to do anything. So when the pain vanished with the motion, he was baffled. That's not right. Even if they'd already burrowed all the way in, shouldn't there be some sign of them? These things couldn't have drilled into his flesh just to take a nap, could they? He examined his arm in confusion. Whether this counted as good news was debatable, but there wasn't a single wound on it, as if the pain and the scales had been nothing but a hallucination. The worst news was that the arm didn't belong to him at all. In fact, Ryan did a quick sweep of himself and his surroundings. To put it precisely, nothing here was his, not the body, not the room. He was not, and could not be, a hulking slab of a man who actually deserved words like broad-shouldered and barrel-chested. Nor could he possibly be sleeping in a room from the last century that didn't even have a light. He stared blankly around the absurdly sparse space, a table, a wooden wardrobe against one wall, and a bed beside it. That was the room in its entirety. As for lighting, it ran entirely on the crimson moonlight filtering in through the window. Where the hell did I end up? Ryan pressed his fingers to the stranger's temple and rubbed. His head throbbed, his thoughts a jumbled mess. He was certain he'd been lying in bed scrolling on his phone just moments ago, without any stroke of outlandish luck. What was with this transmigration level situation? This probably isn't a dream within a dream, Ryan muttered. Because both the terror and the pain had been far too real. Even so, his hand honestly reached down and gave his thigh a hard pinch. Oh, this guy is built. The sharper-than-expected pain reminded him once again that this was not his original body. I actually transmigrated. That can't be right. I was lying in bed perfectly fine. Ryan was at a loss. He found it difficult to believe what he was seeing, but the leg noticeably thicker than his own was transmitting an undeniably real and vivid ache. After a moment's hesitation, he tried to sift through his memories, curious whether there was anything new in his head. If there wasn't, wouldn't that make it more likely this was just a dream? Everything around him right now looked nothing like a dream, but even the most absurd dream was more probable than him transmigrating out of nowhere, doing absolutely nothing to trigger it. He could swear on his life he hadn't had any stroke of outlandish luck. But that small hope was crushed by reality without mercy. As he reached into his memories, he did recall things, fragments of a stranger's life that had absolutely nothing to do with him. The last thread of hope quietly died. He really had transmigrated. On an ordinary, uneventful evening, without a single sign or warning, he had transmigrated into someone else's body. My phone. My games. I want to file a complaint. If transmigration is real, is there something like a space-time management bureau that handles this kind of thing? I didn't get any stroke of luck. This is an illegal migration. Ryan felt himself spiraling. He waited a few seconds. No voice, no figure materialized. Web novels have misled me badly. He let out a long sigh and resigned himself to combing through these memories that weren't his. Things are what they are. Figure out the situation first. Because here it was, the middle of the night, and this guy was just lying on the floor. By the crimson moonlight, Ryan could even make out the shattered glass bottle nearby. Something had clearly gone very wrong on this end. The memories, when he dug into them, wiped the expression right off his face. Gambling addiction, got thrown out of the family home. Chased rumors of supernatural power. Believed a scrap of paper at face value. Dead on his own doorstep in the dead of night. 4 sentences summed up everything that had happened to this poor idiot. And the cause of death. 2 words, self-destruction. He had genuinely believed a man he'd only met twice, the one who'd sold him a slip of paper. He'd spent 3 years scouring the occult black markets of several cities for the ingredients listed on that scrap, calling it a potion formula. Then, the very night he finally gathered everything, he mixed them together, drank whatever came out, and died chasing so-called supernatural power. As for occultism, anything related to supernatural power broadly fell under its umbrella. Even though most people in this world didn't believe occultism was real, there was no shortage of people obsessed with it. By any measure, this looked like a fool who trusted a con man, brewed a dubious remedy from an unverified recipe, and successfully poisoned himself to death. That's exactly what Ryan would have thought if he didn't have this big idiot's memories. If the memories didn't clearly show that those mostly solid ingredients, simply mixed together, had genuinely transformed into a pool of dim, unassuming liquid that made you inexplicably thirsty for no reason. And if the strange sensations the idiot experienced while dying weren't eerily similar to what Ryan had felt waking up and far too bizarre to be chalked up to poisoning, he would have thought exactly that. As for those sensations, dread and terror was a simplification. The real experience defied precise description. If Ryan had to put it into words, it was like going mad while remaining fully lucid. More accurately, every part of him, mind included, plunged into some frenzied state, raging at everything within reach, venting a pain that had no name. And yet he stayed conscious through all of it, watching every inch of himself, including his own mind, howl and thrash as if something alive had taken over. He'd never drunk anything he shouldn't have, and he'd never died before. But he instinctively felt that experience was no hallucination. It had been far too vivid, too searing, too deeply unsettling, the kind of thing that sent ice crawling across your skin just at the memory of it. Even now, with those sensations faded, the mere thought of them stirred the same impulse, a mirror image of the feeling in that moment, an urge to destroy everything around him, himself included. Ryan shook his head hard, forcing himself away from those now disturbing impressions. And the strangeness didn't stop there. Perhaps because the big idiot was dead, or perhaps because of the potion itself, the memories were fragmented and riddled with gaps. Even ones that should have left a strong impression were blurred, like his birth parents' names. Or the scrap of paper he'd treasured for years, convinced it would grant him supernatural power. Ryan couldn't reconstruct its exact contents. He picked himself up off the floor and quickly skimmed through what memories remained, confirming this was true across the board. Everything was impressionistic at best, hazy and broken, completely stripped of continuity and missing a heap of specific details. It left him wondering whether he'd even be able to read the writing in this world, and it left him cursing the gambling addict whose shoes he now wore. You've managed to endanger yourself and potentially me too. You absolutely deserved to get conned. If you'd just asked the formula seller to demonstrate this so-called supernatural power first, I'd at least give you a point for having some sense. Oh, when did I stop noticing how cold this floor is? Great. Hope transmigrating into this idiot hasn't dragged my IQ down with him. He'd paid special attention to the memory of when the big guy had purchased the potion formula. The seller said it. The idiot believed it. Zero hesitation, zero skepticism. Objectively speaking, the seller hadn't completely lied. From the big guy's memories, Ryan could confirm that what happened when the potion was brewed would have defied common sense even by the standards of this world. Still not a reason for you, you idiot, to believe it was going to give you supernatural power. Ryan exhaled slowly, pulling himself back to calm. He turned his attention to the only table in the room, where a stone-weighted slip of paper lay the potion formula. Sequence 9, Assassin. Primary ingredients, root tendrils of the shadow poison flower, black feathers of the cockatrice. Secondary ingredients, 100 milliliters concentrated vinegar, 3 petals of the shadow poison flower, 10 drops of buttercup essential oil, 1 live spider. Assassin. Ryan had just allowed himself a small sigh of relief at still being able to read the script of this other world, and then glanced at his current stocky frame. He almost laughed. But when his gaze drifted to the boxes on the table containing the materials listed in the formula, he went completely silent. Familiar objects nudged the memories back to life, and Ryan recalled a scene so ridiculous he didn't know whether to laugh or despair. Before brewing the potion, the big idiot had discovered that the live spider, one of the secondary ingredients, was dead. Rather than go catch a new one, he'd shrugged it off with close enough and gone ahead without it. You absolutely deserved it, Ryan finally thought, no longer holding back. You really, truly deserved everything you got. Author's note. This chapter my phone, my games. I want to file a complaint. March 20, 8:32 Guangdong. Chapter 11 Opening up new possibilities. After returning both sacred texts to the shelf, he searched the library for more books on the races of the Age of Darkness. Unsurprisingly, everything he found was mythology and legend. The one thing worth noting, the northern Forsaken people, owing to their generally large frames, had long believed themselves to carry giant blood. The bloodline had simply weakened over too many generations, leaving them merely taller than most, rather than truly giant. The big idiot had been teased more than once at school for his size, called a northern barbarian. He had a vague memory of his father mentioning that their family did, in fact, carry half Forsaken blood. Given that the gods were, at their core, extraordinaries, Ryan couldn't help wondering whether the god of war had some connection to the giant race. Otherwise, there was no reason to go around promoting giant blood as a point of pride. In this day and age, having blue hair could earn you discrimination. It was a common trait of those with elven heritage, so having giant blood and not being discriminated against, but actually taking pride in it, was odd. Maybe the god of war was a traitor to the giant race, Ryan speculated. Betraying your own people for godhood wasn't exactly an unheard-of story. And if the god himself had once been a giant, then giant blood would naturally become a mark of honor among his followers. Still, how exactly does giant blood get passed down? Can a human body even handle it? That question actually puzzled him more. Surely it isn't literal bloodline degradation. Well, maybe it is degradation, just not of the blood itself but of the supernatural power. Without it, you lose the physical form. Because the giants of the old age had been able to go toe-to-toe with the gods, perhaps every giant once possessed supernatural power. Modern Forsaken people, being mostly ordinary humans without that power, couldn't maintain the 3 to 4 meter height of true giants, so they'd degraded. Not a bad theory, actually. Dong, 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 the noon bell rang out right on schedule. It's already noon. With his current hearing, it wasn't hard to tell that the sound was coming from the clock tower in the square outside. I can't believe I actually had the patience to read biographies and mythology all morning. It felt strangely similar to the experience of cracking open a new history textbook at the start of a school term, that same inexplicable excitement. Followed, inevitably, by complete boredom before the first class was even over, by which point he'd usually already flipped through the whole book 2 or 3 times. Life had a way of surprising you. He'd assumed that after leaving school, the only things he'd be able to read for any length of time were web novels and technical manuals. The reason he'd gone straight to work after university instead of pursuing graduate school was simple exhaustion. He had never once felt satisfaction from doing homework to prove he'd learned something. He waved to the young librarian on his way out and headed southwest. His destination, the Kevin Bar, located on the border between the Docklands and the slum district. He had no appetite for lunch, and nothing nearby was within his budget anyway. Ryan set off at a brisk, ordinary pace toward the Docklands. When the buildings around him grew increasingly run down and dilapidated, Ryan glanced around. Confirming no one had a direct line of sight to him, he stepped into the shade out of reach of the sun and vanished. Then he extended the hem of his jacket into the sunlight and immediately reappeared. The docks were still in the thick of unloading the morning's last shipment. Sailors and dockworkers hadn't yet broken for their midday rest, the brief window when they'd wander into bars. Which meant it also wasn't yet time for the kind of under-the-table dealings that needed some cover, so Kevin Schneider, the owner of the Kevin Bar, almost certainly hadn't arrived yet. Whether it was the bar itself or the underground trading market below, he only provided the space. As long as no one caused a scene, he was practically invisible to ordinary patrons. No reason for him to show up this early. The other reason Ryan had come out now was to use the daylight Docklands for testing his assassin abilities. Broad daylight wasn't ideal for an assassin, but something that only finds you at convenient moments isn't really an accident. Fully merged back into the shadow, Ryan approached a taller building, intent on determining exactly how high he needed to be before featherfall would trigger. He picked out a reference point and a launch spot, then crouched and jumped hard, but it was well below the threshold. As expected, he didn't even clear his own knee height. No surprise that it didn't trigger. He caught the railing as planned, bent his right foot onto a protrusion he'd already identified, straightened up to gain more height, then kicked off the wall again. This time featherfall activated normally. That surprised him more than he expected. He was already well past anything a normal person could do, but he had no such thing as a wall kick double jump. The height of that second leap hadn't been impressive. He hadn't actually expected featherfall to activate. The main point of the whole maneuver had been to test how accurately he could gauge his own height. It was only by getting outside and moving around that Ryan began to realize the assassin potion had given him far more than knowledge and abilities. Since finishing breakfast, he'd gradually noticed that he wasn't just well versed in assassin fundamentals, tracking, disguise, infiltration and the like. He was also acutely sensitive to elevation, routes, terrain, and the positions of people around him. He'd been effortlessly memorizing potentially useful terrain features along his entire route without thinking about it. Like clearing fog of war and mapping out the area in a game. Fortunately, the mental map didn't come with specific details or floating exclamation points. Otherwise he might genuinely have suspected he'd transmigrated into a video game. In any case, this potion was no joke. It was literally rewriting his DNA. Skills and instincts that a real assassin might spend 7 or 8 years, maybe decades, Building up had been packed into his head overnight and etched into his bones. He glanced back at his earlier reference point and confirmed that the experience-backed instincts were far more reliable and precise than the vaguely described supernatural abilities. His estimated height matched actual height almost exactly. And that was exactly what surprised him. At this height, he was fairly certain a normal person would, at worst, only get injured from the fall, and for an assassin, a tuck and roll would have handled it fine, aside from the wall in the way. That's not even that high. So how exactly does this ability decide whether the height qualifies? He was still turning that over when he reached out a hand to stop his face from making close acquaintance with the opposite wall. Activating Featherfall didn't send him drifting straight down like a feather. He continued along the diagonal trajectory he'd already been on, upward and forward. And the fact that he'd stopped moving but wasn't falling reminded him of something else. Featherfall only freed him from gravity, every other force still applied normally. These games have misled me. Who else could say they'd been tripped up by video game logic somewhere other than an argument? Ryan gave the wall a thoughtful push, repositioned himself between the two walls, then deactivated Featherfall and dropped. Through repeated toggling and careful height calibration, he eventually worked out the minimum trigger height for Featherfall, roughly 3 meters. More interesting to him was that this height was noticeably higher than what he'd reached on his wall kick jump, and it sat right at the threshold where a straight drop would still be manageable for an assassin without impeding immediate action afterward. Land, absorb, roll. Without needing anything more complex, just a basic shock reduction tuck, he landed solidly. If the wall hadn't been in the way, that height wouldn't even have slowed him from immediately accelerating into a run. So what's the difference between a straight drop and a wall kick jump? He thought it over as he melted back into the shadows. The landing sound hadn't been loud enough to disturb any ordinary person, given the distance to those around him. But what if someone nearby wasn't ordinary? He moved to a different spot. This time the two walls were closer together, but that didn't matter. He jumped again, this time mimicking a high jump technique, keeping his body roughly parallel to the ground at the apex, and holding that position. He didn't push hard, in case his guess was wrong and the fall hurt. Featherfall activated again. So the threshold is anything above the maximum height an assassin can safely land from without affecting subsequent movement. He laced his hands behind his head and considered it idly. The wall kick jump had triggered Featherfall because he'd still had forward momentum. The distance he'd cover would have meant hitting the wall even with a perfect roll, which would have disrupted any immediate follow-up action, even without injury. A straight vertical drop had no such problem. Which means the threshold is determined by my own judgment. If I jumped blind with no idea how high I was, would Featherfall activate even from a height that would normally kill someone? The thought struck him out of nowhere. Under his current circumstances, that scenario was nearly impossible to engineer. It would require jumping blind into completely unfamiliar terrain. But still, as he neared the ground, another idea surfaced. He kicked off the left wall, used the rebound to meet the right wall, pressed a hand flat against it to break his descent, then began climbing with the other hand. And that was how a man who almost certainly exceeded 200 pounds moved up a building face as soundlessly and swiftly as a gecko. From friction braking at the start to barely grazing the surface with his toes once his thinking opened up, Ryan moved between buildings at a speed he couldn't have imagined before, utterly silent. His augmented hearing and eagle-sharp vision fed him a constant stream of information about his surroundings. His brain mapped the area as he went, plotting routes, anticipating sight lines from inside buildings and from anyone on the ground who might glance up. He didn't feel rushed or clumsy for a single second, more like someone who'd been doing this for years and had simply forgotten. In pure wall climbing terms, I've already got The Witcher beat by a mile. The thought came with a flicker of genuine excitement. Author's note: this chapter, if I jumped blind with no idea how high I was, would Featherfall activate even from a height that would normally kill someone? Hune, the ability doesn't work on subjective belief alone. Author reply: you're right, I was mistaken when writing this. I thought there was a height limit on the ability. There isn't, which is why the line ended up there. Chapter 12: The Price of Power. This transmigration isn't all bad. After another half hour or so of moving between buildings, Ryan decided to revise his opinion of the whole situation. No phone, no computer, but this more than made up for it. This was far more entertaining than park hour, and with essentially no risk. I wonder what the highest mountain in this world is. He was already quietly thinking about something more exciting. For him now, jumping off a mountain peak was barely even extreme sports territory. No special preparation required, he could do it whenever he felt like it. But first, actual business. He released the eave and dropped silently to the ground. He'd been running through the southeast district this whole time, partly because he'd gotten carried away, partly because nobody would find your sudden appearance anywhere in this part of the city suspicious. Though barely anyone called it the southeast district anymore. Everyone just called it the slums. The Kevin Bar, sitting on the edge of the docklands, wasn't far from here, and he reached it quickly. More precisely, it was the other way around. The Kevin Bar was the landmark that divided the docklands from the slums. Moen didn't have an officially designated slum quarter, it was just where the most desperate people had ended up clustering. He pushed open the bar's door and walked into immediate noise. Only 7 or 8 men inside, but dock workers were accustomed to yelling, and they did everything at volume. The bar wasn't large. With winter coming and no gambling happening at midday, the space usually reserved for card games had been filled with tables, so it wasn't cramped. Plenty of the dock crowd liked to gamble, but the stretch of the Tassoc River beside Moen froze over in winter, and a Moen winter had a way of teaching a lesson to anyone who kept gambling after losing a major income. So even after dark, this time of year saw only a few itch-fingered regulars sitting down for a hand or two of Down with Evil. He walked to the bar. Before he'd even sat down, the bartender called out, "You again, big fella." The usual. Ryan flicked a pence across the counter. "Big build, small tips," the bartender muttered. Ryan, whose hearing now made that perfectly audible, didn't react, just signaled for the bartender to lean in, then lowered his voice. "Little Schneider. I hear you've known old Schneider for close to 20 years. The bartender was nearly 30, but his baby face had earned him that nickname at least until he had children of his own. There was no escaping it. "Spit it out." The bartender set a mug of rye ale on the counter in front of Ryan with a flat expression. Kevin Schneider, the bar's owner, had no wife, only a child he'd taken in 17 years ago. That child was the man now standing behind the bar. "Just curious. Does old Schneider really have that kind of ability? Since when are you interested in that?" The bartender gave him a sideways look. But Ryan had been coming in for a year, and this wasn't exactly classified information. "Obviously he does," the bartender said, keeping his voice down. "Otherwise how would the business run? Do you know when he first got it?" "He had it before he took me in." "Why, you want some too?" "Drop it. The old man's never sold it to anyone." "No, I want to ask him some questions." "Is old Schneider here today?" "Questions?" The bartender glanced at Ryan, who had gone quiet, clearly understanding that this wasn't the right place for details. "Wait here. I'll go ask." He motioned the dealer, who was moonlighting as a server since the gambling tables were closed, to cover for him and headed off. Ryan watched him go, then picked up his rye ale and took a sip. The taste was exactly what he'd expected. Cheap was cheap. You should be called South Grain Ale, he thought to himself, playing on a Chinese homophone to take the edge off his nerves. Fortunately, the bartender was quick, and was back before long. "Upstairs, first door on the left." He said it briskly and gestured Ryan toward it. "Thanks, Schneider. Next time be more generous, big fella." "Next time for sure." The bartender didn't catch the full meaning and didn't overthink it, just gave a nod. Ryan didn't explain either. He headed straight through the bar and up the stairs. He heard a hearty, satisfied grunt before he even reached the second floor. Old man's enjoying his meal. Ryan, who didn't like talking while eating, silently extended a mental middle finger. Not out of any real grievance, his ears were just a little too good, and he'd happened to be focusing on what old Schneider was up to. At the top of the stairs, he found the old man hadn't even bothered to close his door. Before Ryan could say anything, old Schneider waved him in. Inside sat a man whose build wasn't much smaller than Ryan's, eating with obvious gusto. His face was weathered and worn, the deep lines beside his broad nose etched long and hard, his back slightly stooped, but no one who looked at him would doubt that if he wanted to, he could pull out an axe and lay flat a room full of men without breaking a sweat. On the table sat 3 sizable plates of fish, a large bowl of fish soup, and a bottle of strong rauki being the local term for a potent malt-distilled spirit, of which there were many varieties. The strong kind was a particular favorite among sailors. Most of what appeared to be a rather lavish lunch had already been demolished. Still going strong, Ryan thought, genuinely impressed, as he took a seat. He'd barely settled before the old man spoke. "It's you, big fella." Old Schneider recognized him immediately. Ryan was mildly surprised. "You know me, sir?" "Ha. A build like yours isn't easy to forget. So what is it you wanted to ask me?" Aside from the laugh, Ryan had mostly caught only the final question. The old man spoke fast, and even with the big idiot's memories, he could barely follow it. "Old Schneider isn't drinking a storm church potion, is he?" Ryan wondered privately. The storm church prized an approach as fierce as the storm itself. Its punishment vessels were no strangers to aggression, the type to go straight for the kill if you didn't comply, without a second thought. And the more common sequence 9 and 8 formulas did occasionally surface for sale, even the ones matching a church's lineage you just couldn't always tell real from fake. Ryan didn't hesitate. Even if old Schneider had some connection to the church, this didn't feel like a sting operation. If it were, they'd have moved on the big idiot before he ever became an extraordinary. "Here's the situation, sir. I gathered everything I needed yesterday and became an extraordinary. When I was adding one of the secondary ingredients, the live spider, it bit me. I yanked it off with a bit more force than intended and tossed it into the potion. Looking back, I may have used a little too much force. The spider might have been a little bit dead by that point." The rest of the sentence died in his throat under old Schneider's increasingly peculiar stare. Even with the less embarrassing cover story, Ryan had to admit it still sounded spectacularly stupid. This was the first time in his life he'd been looked at quite like that. "Is that what you came to ask me?" Old Schneider stopped eating entirely, leaned back in his chair, and asked at a more measured pace. Ryan nodded. He could have sworn he detected, in that single question, 30% exasperated amusement, 30% genuine astonishment, and 40% the particular pity reserved for the monumentally dim. The old man had been so struck he couldn't even speak at full speed. "But I didn't do it," Ryan screamed internally. This was the most egregious injustice he'd ever had no way to explain away. "You're very lucky, young man. There are those who've become extraordinary without using the secondary ingredients at all. But surviving the pain the potion brings without becoming a monster, you're genuinely lucky." Old Schneider spoke slowly. "A monster?" Ryan immediately thought of the scale-like things burrowing into his arm when he first woke up. So the big idiot had already been dead and in the process of turning. And his own transmigration had interrupted it. "You didn't know?" Reading the surprise on Ryan's face, old Schneider continued at the same unhurried pace. "Then let me tell you something else that's not great news. Even after successfully becoming an extraordinary, some people break down under the potion's ongoing influence, the most obvious sign being mysterious whispering in the ears. Others lose their reason through the corruption or temptation of evil gods. Either way, the result is the same: they become a raving lunatic or a horrifying monster. It can happen over something as simple as losing your temper, letting rage swallow your reason for one moment. And you might never find your way back. This is called losing control. Aside from being killed, it's probably the most common way an extraordinary dies." By the time old Schneider finished, Ryan had exactly 2 thoughts in his head. What kind of cursed path is this? Is it too late to quit? Does this happen to the church's extraordinaries too? He asked, face pinched. No one is exempt. Not a single person. Some say it's the necessary price of power. Others say it's the lingering resentment of the supernatural creatures killed for the primary ingredients. Still others say it's a curse laid by the Creator upon those foolish enough to covet divine power, that potions carry supernatural force precisely because they are fragments of the Creator's own divine energy. Heh. So, young man, do you regret becoming an extraordinary? He looked at Ryan's expression with a warm, grandmotherly smile. I didn't choose this, Ryan thought, on the verge of tears. In everything he'd read about dangerous cultivation paths, this ranked among the worst. Who in their right mind would pick something like this willingly? You could just be practicing normally, and then one day, without warning, lose your mind and become a monster. That was insane. Mr. Schneider, this morning I had another episode similar to drinking the potion, though much milder. There's also been a strange voice whispering in my ear. Is that the potion's influence you're describing? Yes. That's the potion trying to change you. Outside of moments when your focus is completely absorbed like combat or when you're particularly content, the potion's influence can surface at any time. Especially when you're not in good shape. So the key is keeping yourself in a good state that keeps you from losing control as much as possible. Ryan glanced at the old man's substantial lunch as he asked. Old Schneider caught the look and laughed out loud. Good attitude, kid. That's also why some extraordinaries who can't handle the potion turn to heavy drinking, gambling, or addictive substances even though none of it changes the outcome. He knocked back another long pull. One more thing, keep your curiosity in check, young man. Extraordinaries are far more likely than ordinary people to attract the attention of evil gods and other strange entities. That was old Schneider's parting addition. Author's note: this chapter, when I was adding one of the secondary ingredients, the live spider, it bit me. I yanked it off with a bit more force than intended and tossed it into the potion. Looking back, I may have used a little too much force. The spider might have been a little bit dead by that point. 202409290137311189 The 2nd of December 432 Tianjin. The original body owner died in mortal combat with a spider. XD 2025-051-3464 The 2nd of October 412 Shandong. So the original owner was also a little bit dead. Chapter 13 A small celebration. I understand. Thank you very much for telling me all of this, Mr. Schneider. Ryan stood and thanked him with genuine formality. Big as a house and still perfectly polite. Honestly, none of this is unfamiliar to any extraordinary who's managed to survive a while. The person who sold you the formula, they didn't say any of this. Old Schneider seemed genuinely puzzled by that. Ryan weighed it for a moment, then nodded and shifted the blame without a second thought. He only told me that after I'd adapted to and mastered the current potion, I'd need to find the corresponding sequence 8 to continue gaining strength. Was that also a lie, Mr. Schneider? Old Schneider shook his head. Not exactly a lie, just incomplete. The potion's influence and the whispering will decrease in frequency over time, if you can hold out. Once you're in a normal state and the sense that the potion is changing you has mostly faded, that means you've fully adapted and mastered it. At that point, you can try taking the next potion and attempt to advance. I see. Though I suppose I don't need to worry about that for a while. Ryan settled back into his chair. That's true. But even if the power is greater, whether when you first drink a potion or after successfully advancing, the influence you'll have to face only gets stronger. Whether it's worth it is hard to say. Old Schneider drained another long pull, and for a moment his expression was thoughtful. How long does it usually take before the potion's influence fades to something manageable, Mr. Schneider? That was what Ryan was more curious about than the old man's implication. Hard to say. Some people, shorter. Some, longer. As a general rule, expect around 3 years, and even then, advancement is never guaranteed. Ryan nodded, taking that in, then stood again with the same deliberateness. Even so, I'm very grateful for everything you've told me today, Mr. Schneider. Before the old man could respond, he continued. Is there anything I could help you with? Something low risk, with a bit of pay attached, would be even better. He spread his hands with a resigned shrug. After buying the potion ingredients, I'm down to under £1. Old Schneider looked at his face and said, making money isn't difficult for an extraordinary, as long as you're willing to risk attracting the church's attention. Ryan nodded to show he understood. Old Schneider looked away and went back to his now-cooled meal. Don't worry about it too much. And I'm just a bar owner, nothing particularly complicated on my end. Then I won't keep you from your lunch. When the old man nodded, Ryan left him with a farewell and pulled the door shut behind him. May the rest of your days be filled with peace and good fortune, Mr. Schneider. After Ryan left, the room was quiet for a moment before old Schneider murmured softly to himself. That's no easy thing. On Ryan's end, he felt a small pang of guilt. I think I dampened the old man's mood. My bad. He could tell old Schneider was noticeably quieter after their meeting than before. Still, even knowing he'd stumbled down a crooked path and would face greater risks than ordinary people for the foreseeable future, it wasn't enough to bring his lingering anxiety back. The worst-case scenario with the big idiot's reckless tinkering had turned out fine. That was what mattered. As for losing control and becoming a monster, alarming as it wasn't alarming enough to put the dread back in his chest. Today's morning episode had been unpleasant, yes. But one look at old Schneider told you everything. Whatever this was, it was less than half as frightening as the moment Ryan had first pieced together the full story of the big idiot's improvised spider solution. He came back downstairs, passed through the bar, and sat down in front of the bartender again. A deal's a deal. Give me the most expensive thing on the lunch menu. With his worries lifted, Ryan was feeling generous. He went straight for the top. Of course, having been here before, he knew this was a bar, not a restaurant. Most expensive wasn't going to bankrupt him. The bartender held out a hand with a skeptical look. 7 pence. Ryan slapped a sou onto his palm. Add another portion for 5 pence. Otherwise it won't be enough. Now it was the bartender's turn to look startled. The man who always ordered the cheapest thing on the menu had just put down a full sou without a moment's hesitation. What happened to you? Good news. The bartender had his guesses, but skipped the usual come into money jab. Ryan just gave a small nod and added, "No fish, please. Bones would ruin my mood." The bartender pressed his lips together and said nothing. He leaned into the kitchen door beside the stairs and gave 2 quick hand signals. Ryan glanced at the bar counter and spotted the rye ale he'd ordered before going up, still sitting there. He didn't mind. He picked it up, found a window seat, and settled in, sipping slowly while turning over old Schneider's words. It wasn't that he doubted the old man was lying. But thinking it over now, calmly, if everyone who became an extraordinary had to white-knuckle it through the potion's influence at all times, with no recourse, that was simply absurd. Dying upon advancing to the next sequence was one thing. But being tormented by the potion indefinitely, with no way to manage it other than sheer willpower? He was only sequence 9, and this morning's mental interference hadn't fully lifted until midday, only after he'd gotten moving and started enjoying himself. And the influence was only supposed to get worse at higher sequences. The idea of a lone, low-ranking sequence 9 just enduring it was one thing. But expecting the most powerful extraordinarist to white-knuckle even stronger effects was genuinely hard to believe. And don't forget, in a world with supernatural power, anyone holding a senior position in an organization like a church had to be a formidable extraordinary. If they were also constantly fighting the potion's influence, what organization would put someone like that in a critical role? Fine under normal conditions, but what about in a crisis, when you need someone reliable every minute? Especially a church that held the order of an entire nation together and could face emergencies at any time. On top of that, there were 9 sequence levels Ryan knew of. Anyone senior enough to run an organization like a church almost certainly wasn't still at sequence 9 or even 6. If a sequence 9 potion could drive people to alcoholism and substance abuse, then a sequence 4 or 3 potion 5 or 6 tiers up had effects that tested whether human willpower could hold at all. Which meant the stronger extraordinarists must have ways of keeping themselves stable at critical moments, techniques for minimizing the potion's interference with day-to-day function. An organization that had existed for at least 1,352 years could not have sustained that if its leadership was in a constant state of instability. Over that span of time, something would have broken. The lower sequence rank and file and unaffiliated wild extraordinarists simply weren't privy to those methods. So Ryan leaned toward the view that these problems old Schneider described were really only serious concerns for small fry extraordinarists at sequence 8 or 9. The world was probably not as terrifying as he'd imagined in the first moment he heard the word losing control. Even in web fiction, a cultivation path where you risked going mad at any point and turning into a monster would have exactly 0 take as a natural talent. Finishing it would be a miracle. There was no scenario where the entire world practiced it en masse. Your lunch, sir. The dealer, moonlighting as a server, set down a plate and a bowl, interrupting his thoughts. Ryan looked it over. Half a pound of oat bread, a small cut of meat in tomato sauce, and a bowl of vegetable soup. No butter for the bread must be the cheaper portion. He made the mental note. The server didn't leave immediately. Sir, Schneider says he'd only had one sip of that rye ale. He's that casual about it. Ryan's eyes went wide with theatrical shock. He hadn't bothered to lower his voice, so everyone in the bar heard it and the bartender's expression went flat again. I already dumped yours, obviously. The voice from behind the bar came through clenched teeth. You drink the cheap stuff yourself? Ryan continued, still with the same look of disbelief. I like what I like. Is that any of your business? The bartender stared at this shameless individual who seemed completely unaware of what he just walked into, his frustration climbing steadily. Ryan stifled a laugh, handed the server a pence, then shot the bartender a questioning look. We good? The bartender ignored him, but Ryan caught the mutter under his breath. Easy. Easy. Can't win this one. Utterly unbothered by the whole exchange, Ryan relaxed and enjoyed his lunch until the server returned and set down a second portion. Looking at the identical setup in front of him, different ingredients, same presentation, Ryan couldn't help asking. Does your cook only know how to pan-fry and make soup? The two portions differed only in that the second used white bread, a different cut of meat, and a different soup variety plus a small smear of butter on the bread. Apologies, sir. We're a bar, not a restaurant. Fair enough. He thought about it and let it go. If the docks didn't make the workers find their own lunch, these bars probably wouldn't bother serving food at all. But there was no denying the price difference showed. Both the bread and the meat in the 7p portion were noticeably better. He couldn't tell what kind of meat it was even after eating it, but that had never mattered to him. If it tasted good, it was good. Just not used to the knife and fork. After a few failed attempts, he lost patience and bit directly into the meat. As he savored what was, in a different world, still the familiar smell of cooked meat, a question drifted back into his mind. Why does the potion keep trying to change whoever drinks it? What is it trying to turn them into? A monster. He thought again about his own transmigration. The big idiot's near-death memories made it clear the man hadn't been that fortunate. If he hadn't transmigrated in at exactly that moment, the big idiot would almost certainly have become a monster. After his conversation with old Schneider, Ryan no longer thought the scale-like things he'd seen burrowing into his arm when he first woke up were merely something that looked like scales. They might have been exactly what they looked like. Monsters having scales wasn't unusual. What he'd taken as scales drilling into flesh was probably the process of losing control interrupted mid-transformation, the monster's traces receding. When he stopped to think about it, he'd occupied the body of a man who had just died, and the loss of control had halted with him. That seemed to confirm what old Schneider had said, the state of a living person was incomparably better than someone at the point of death. More precisely, since the body was the same body, mental and emotional state was the key factor in resisting the potion's changes, staying grounded, and not becoming a monster. The more I look at this, the more it resembles soul-snatching. Having read a great deal of web fiction, Ryan found the whole setup eerily familiar. Except the influence was this obvious, yet a stable mental state was enough to hold it back, and it had even been interrupted mid-process by a transmigration. What kind of soul-snatcher fails this embarrassingly? Author's note, this chapter, the more I look at this, the more it resembles soul-snatching. March 19, 1120 Fujian, isn't it? The potion reshapes the body, mimicking digestion, following the path of its creator. 2025-051 3464, the 2nd of October 416 Shandong. It's not just soul-snatching, there's more coming later. Eldritch mind invaders from beyond the domain. Chapter 14, Lucky finds don't come twice. A sufficiently powerful figure, even one completely dead, still has their obsession infusing the fragments of their power. It drives those fragments to reshape every body that drinks them, futilely attempting resurrection. But because the fragments are incomplete, or because mortals can't withstand it, the process only ends in collapse, becoming a monster. Ryan thought his theory made more sense than anything old Schneider had actually said. At the very least, it explained why the potion kept trying to alter whoever consumed it, and why stronger potions had a stronger effect on the person. Of course, knowing almost nothing about the upper limits of supernatural power in this world, he wasn't about to treat his own speculation as fact. What he could confirm from the moment of his transmigration was this: the key to avoiding loss of control and becoming a monster was maintaining a stable mental state. And knowing that much already put him ahead of most. Having shared that experience himself, he could genuinely understand why an extraordinary might break down, and it wasn't necessarily just the potion's influence. The potion's behavior suddenly hitting you with a wall of pressure, then leaving no trace in between, would naturally produce a sense of helplessness and lost control. And with something like losing control hanging over you like an invisible blade, you never knew when it might fall. Even if your rational mind reminded you 1,000 times to keep a good mental state, all it took was one bad episode for the doubt to creep in. Is this actually working? Once the doubt set in and the resolve wavered, the worry, the fear, the regret, and the pressure could snowball until the weight of it crushed you. By that measure, Ryan considered himself fortunate. His transmigration experience had given him at least some concrete understanding of what losing control looked like. There were alternative explanations. Yes, maybe the process had simply been interrupted because whoever pulled him here didn't want to waste their effort. But didn't that mean he had even less reason to worry about losing control? So even if he couldn't be completely certain, it didn't stop Ryan from feeling like he'd swallowed a reassurance pill. He felt his resolve in resisting the potion's influence was now ironclad. After finishing his 1 sou luxury lunch, he was down to 6 sous total, but that didn't stop him from nodding a casual farewell to the bartender and walking, under the entire bar's unblinking gaze, into an unremarkable-looking room. He pushed the door open. The two men inside, playing cards, recognized him and paid him no further attention. Ryan, familiar with the routine, found the concealed door without trouble and squeezed through. Underground market was technically accurate, but after navigating a passageway that was a bit of a tight fit for someone his size, the market that opened up before him was smaller than a produce market back home. Having already memorized the surrounding terrain, Ryan could confirm that his current position was just beneath a patch of building ruins in the slum district, not far from the Kevin Bar. Someone had quietly cleared out a modest space to use for these technically prohibited transactions. There was genuine merchandise here, but fakes and hard-to-verify oddities made up the majority. Most of the people doing business were ordinary citizens with an interest in the occult. In a world with actual gods, concepts like divination, astrology, meditation, and ritual magic were never unfamiliar. Given enough money and patience, even ordinary people could access them. They just wouldn't do anything. So what changed hands here wasn't necessarily tied to real supernatural power. Tarot cards, pendulums, incense, crystal balls, and other standard occult accessories were all on display, alongside plants and stones that were considered especially pleasing to the gods, useful in rituals of supplication, which also made regular appearances on the stalls. This, in fact, was a big part of why materials related to genuine supernatural power hadn't been completely stamped out despite the church's strict crackdowns. The occult trappings provided ideal cover, and it wasn't entirely pretense, either. Potions and their ilk were unambiguously part of the occult world. Most enthusiasts simply had no idea. Ryan drifted past the stalls without paying them much mind. His funds were down to 6 sous, and the big idiot hadn't understood any of this well enough to distinguish real from fake anyway. Having supernatural abilities didn't make him an occult expert. Calling himself an enthusiast would be an overstatement. His main purpose in visiting was to see if anyone was selling Rossel the Great's notebooks. He was genuinely curious about what his compatriot from 200 years ago had written in a language no one here could read. It was still just past noon, and people continued to trickle in through various entrances, buying, selling, browsing. A market this discreet naturally had more than one way in. The Kevin Bar was simply one provider of space, taking a cut. Access didn't require its approval. He browsed through the growing activity, looping around a few times, until he finally spotted what he was looking for. With his enhanced vision, Ryan recognized it before he was anywhere close. The simplified Chinese characters slightly garbled, but legible. And the content gave him pause. March 6th. Damn, the food here is making me constipated. So your Imperial Majesty's sole use of Chinese in writing was to keep a diary. Ryan had not expected that. Given that this man's romantic exploits had reached foreign ears nearly 200 years after his death, he couldn't exactly have been described as a model of restraint, and yet here was his private writing, the culinary complaints of a constipated conqueror. He crouched in front of the stall with a carefully puzzled expression. "Sir, are these Rossel the Great's notebooks?" He picked up the 2 pages for a look. "These are probably copies someone made, not the originals. Too many errors and omissions. Someone of his stature wouldn't have originals turning up at a place like this." He kept the observation to himself. The stall owner, seeing that Ryan had recognized what he was selling, lit up with excitement. "They are. And I personally went to Buckland 4 or 5 years ago and copied these by hand at the Steam Church's Rossel Memorial Exhibition, which ran several times. After the war, the exhibition was discontinued. What you're holding is essentially the only copy of this content in all of Rouen. How about it, brother? Take it home. You won't regret it." The Church of the God of Steam and Machinery had previously held missionary rights in the Rouen Kingdom, though its followers had been concentrated in major cities. After the war, the Steam Church was forced to withdraw back to Intis and lost those rights in Rouen. Your memory's impressive. The errors and omissions just make it a bit of a guessing game for someone who can actually read it. He kept that thought private too. Ryan shook his head and stood. "No, thank you. Buying something I can't read would just be a waste." The stall owner scrambled to his feet. "Hold on, brother, doesn't matter if you can't read it. You could pick 2 symbols and write them on yourself. They really work. I've tried it myself." Ryan knew it was nonsense, but he couldn't resist. "What kind of effect?" "I feel like women find me more attractive." The owner immediately rolled up his sleeve, revealing 2 unsteadily drawn characters tattooed on his arm and trust and mechanism. "I genuinely thank you for not tattooing damn it on yourself. If you had, I don't know how I'd have kept a straight face." He bit back the laugh and kept it to himself. Then turned around and walked away without a second glance. There hadn't been much of substance in the legible portions anyway. One entry recorded the great emperor's bewilderment at Intis's social openness, specifically regarding a series of encounters that left him uncertain who had pursued whom. Another noted that he had ultimately converted to the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery on account of someone or something called amnesia. Beyond confirming that the great emperor was also a committed adherent of a certain gaming franchise, the 2 diary pages mainly demonstrated how genuinely open Intisian society had been. The number of Intisian ladies who had been involved with the emperor, or with whom the emperor had been involved, had grown large enough that he'd taken to referring to them collectively as the ladies. "Looks like I'll need to find the actual diary through a real extraordinary after all. Ordinary people are too unreliable. Here's hoping the emperor wrote something useful in there." That settled, Ryan extinguished any remaining hope of striking it lucky here and left the market. As he walked back toward the slum district, his mind turned to more practical matters: money. The big idiot might have been able to tolerate that decrepit room, but he absolutely could not. No private washroom, shared bathing facilities, hot water not guaranteed, and a queue for all of it. He genuinely could not bear it. As for how to make money, that was hardly a puzzle for someone who could vanish into shadows and scale walls without a sound. He wouldn't stoop to stealing from honest working people, many of them barely scraped by on a full day's labor, and taking that felt unconscionable. But the slums weren't just poverty, they were chaos. Law enforcement was essentially non-existent. He didn't believe for a second that no one there was running some kind of crooked operation. Money from that kind of source he could take without losing a moment's sleep. As for finding it with vision and hearing well beyond any ordinary person, the only requirements were patience and time. The sort of business that could only operate under cover of darkness would be even more visible to someone with night vision. Just watch out for accidentally targeting the same people the Church of the Evernight Goddess's Nighthawks are already watching. He made a quiet mental note. If something was too egregious and the situation allowed, he could tip off the police directly. If not, he could find a way to draw them over. Punish criminal activity and pocket the proceeds in the chaos. Was there a more elegantly balanced income strategy? Failing all that, his build and the physical conditioning the assassin potion had given him made him a perfectly viable bodyguard. And the potion had come with combat technique built in. Even without his supernatural abilities, he could hold his own. Having a marketable skill is a wonderful thing. Easier than job hunting back in my old world, that's for sure. Author's note: this chapter I genuinely thank you for not tattooing damn it on yourself. If you had, I don't know how I'd have kept a straight face. 2025-051-3464, no location date listed. Chapter 15 Poverty and Hope. Ryan's plan was solid, but reality has a way of delivering a hit exactly where you don't expect it. After spending over an hour mapping out the slum district and filling in his mental terrain, Ryan stopped at the far edge of the southeast outskirts. He needed a moment. Because the hour hadn't turned up any trace of money, but it had turned up plenty to weigh on him. His own clothes were worn, but at least intact. The slum residents were filthy and falling apart. Their bodies were frightening in their thinness, legs like bamboo poles, faces that said they hadn't eaten a full meal in a long time. The living conditions, needless to say, were difficult to observe even from near rooftop height. Beds were rare. Most people slept on the floor, packed together, with barely room to find a spot. The blankets were threadbare and rotting. He worried about how they'd survive the winter coming. If the dock workers looked tired and without hope, the slum residents were something else entirely, a numbness so complete it was barely human, as if they were moving without any consciousness behind it. It unsettled him enough that he found himself wondering whether the concept of the zombie in his world had been inspired by exactly this. The resemblance was genuinely eerie. Both the Storm Church and the Church of the Evernight Goddess ran poorhouses and free vocational schools, but it was a drop in an ocean. These people worked from dawn to dark for barely enough to survive on. They had no time to see a doctor, let alone learn. At most, children too young to be useful were sent to attend. After an hour of watching, Ryan found himself understanding something he hadn't before. In those turbulent eras of his own world's history, what had made the conviction of reformers so unshakable, what had made them willing to risk everything, was exactly this. See a scene of hopelessness this suffocating, this airless, and how could anyone look away? A pity this is a world with supernatural power, Ryan thought with a bitter smile. Forget being a humanities student. Even if Marx himself showed up, he'd have a headache. Ryan was only sequence 9 and already far removed from ordinary people. The gap at higher sequences was incomprehensible. A single powerful extraordinary wiping out an entire army of ordinary soldiers wasn't out of the question. Though it wasn't entirely hopeless, either. The gods were real, which meant the churches didn't have to stand against progress and change. They might even welcome it. Every charitable institution he'd seen so far had been founded and run by a church. Inadequate, yes, but compared to the kind of capitalists who deserved a lamppost, the churches were at least still treating people as people. Rossel the Great overthrowing the Intisian royal family and establishing the Republic was another precedent. Though the changes he'd brought, in hindsight, hadn't gone far enough. In a world with real gods, no matter how the times changed, as long as the divine power behind the churches remained standing, the churches would remain standing until the day technology could rival the gods themselves. Though Ryan suspected that even if that day arrived, it would be the gods, not some ordinary person, who held the technology. However you looked at it, this was an ugly era. Ugly enough that he found himself thinking, for once, that his luck at being born when he was had been rather good. But it wasn't without hope either. Supernatural power had added untold disaster to this world, but it had also provided something in return. He didn't know quite why, but gods who needed faith weren't the worst arrangement, were they? The gap between needing faith and being accountable to people wasn't necessarily wide. However a god actually felt about it, those carrying out divine will were still human, and specifically, people who had chosen faith over power and wealth. At least more hopeful than a lot of the novels I've read, he thought. After sitting for quite a while, Ryan finally stood, let out a long breath. All right. Enough. Stop overthinking. Take care of yourself first. There's nothing I can do right now anyway. He slipped back into the shadows. He wasn't changing his approach to earning money, just being more deliberate about choosing targets that had as little connection to the genuinely poor as possible. He didn't want his actions making already miserable lives worse. Or just be cleaner about it, he murmured to himself. Back in the slums, looking at the scene in front of him, he felt again, sharply, that he was not of this world and not of this era. I'll never understand people who want to transmigrate to ancient times. Weren't they afraid of ending up worse off? He kept himself at near rooftop height, leaving no impression of having been there. It also gave him a better vantage point for spotting anything suspicious or outright conspicuous. Petty theft was so common here it barely registered as suspicious. Poverty didn't equal crime, but it led there and no one could blame people for it. Concern for ethics and propriety only arose once survival was no longer in question. It was worse in a world where the dead could disturb the living. Poverty could drive more extreme behavior here than anywhere else. The Ruin Kingdom had specific laws requiring burial in designated cemeteries to reduce the incidence of the undead, water spirits, and vengeful ghosts. Throwing a body in a river or a shallow grave was a criminal act. But even at the lowest available fees, the cost in time and money was still a real burden for the destitute. On his route through, he'd already passed a few bodies simply left where they were, not yet buried. They'd probably vanish one night quietly interred by relatives, in whatever hasty way they could manage. Ryan himself had no feelings about what happened to his remains after death. In slightly dramatic terms, you could pour his ashes into concrete, mix them into a wall, and he genuinely wouldn't care. Dead was dead. Even in a world where bodies could get back up, whatever animated them had nothing to do with the person they'd been. But that didn't stop him from understanding the quiet grief and helplessness of it. Moving between buildings did restrict his sightlines, but with the sun out, he couldn't use shadow concealment on rooftops. If a church extraordinary happened to be in the area, the exposure risk was too high. Still, he wasn't entirely relying on chance. Beyond watching for potential targets, he was mapping the area, noting where the crowds were thickest and targets least likely, identifying the overlooked corners where something larger might be hiding. A patient hunter, working out where prey was most likely to be found. Even if the daytime yielded nothing, that didn't mean the effort was wasted. The night was long. And besides, he might look like a berserker, but he'd drunk an assassin potion. Knowing the terrain mattered. Whether for taking action or for running, you couldn't do either well without it. This wasn't a game, and he had no illusions of being the kind of omnipotent assassin who kills everyone in sight and calls it a successful infiltration. For an assassin, gathering intelligence is the first step and the most important. The work was a bit tedious, though. Whenever he noticed his focus starting to drift from the length of time, he'd let his thoughts wander briefly to reset himself. One thing he'd been turning over, during the hours when sunlight made it harder to operate freely, he could volunteer at one of the church's charitable organizations. It was partly about helping, even in a small way. It was also about building goodwill with the church. If he were ever suspected by a church extraordinary, a record of voluntary service wouldn't clear his name, but it might soften the response. Besides, he didn't have a day job anymore, and this world had neither games nor computers. Sitting idle wasn't really his style. He'd also considered dirtying himself up, putting on something more ragged, and mixing into the slums to gather information directly. People's eyes were sharp if you knew how to listen. The community itself could point you toward your targets. Then he thought about his own build and height, and quietly dropped the idea. Who would believe a malnourished slum dweller could be this size? That wasn't a problem even the potion's disguise techniques could solve. Time drifted by in this somewhat tedious fashion until a shifty, slight figure finally crossed into his field of vision. The man looked to be around 5'5", moving in a rhythm that alternated fast and slow, keeping to the edge of the path, glancing back periodically. The look of someone trying to shake a tail. Ryan's interest sharpened immediately. He followed. The slight man clearly knew the area. After a short distance, he ducked into an alley and began moving through a maze of irregular terrain and debris, cutting and turning rapidly. Most people, even with reasonable familiarity with the neighborhood, would have struggled to keep up. For Ryan, watching from above, it was no effort at all. He even had attention left over to track the direction the man had come from and saw nothing particular there. Did he already shake them? Or was there never anyone? Eventually, the slight man slipped into a half-collapsed ruin. The straight-line distance wasn't far. His sightline was blocked, but with his sharp hearing Ryan picked up the faint sound of a wooden panel being pulled aside and then set back. A basement. His curiosity deepened as he moved closer. Even through the planks, the deliberately muffled conversation below reached him clearly. "You're getting slower." A woman's voice, slightly reproachful. "Sorry, sweetheart. I came straight here the moment I clocked off. It's just lately, being with you all the time, People are starting to wonder where I've been. So I circled around a bit to be safe. I'm not sharing you with anyone. A man's voice, a little urgent. What's the rush? I'm not going anywhere. The woman's tone softened into a gentle pout. The man gave a low chuckle and didn't answer. A moment later, all that could be heard were two slightly quickened sets of breathing. Outside, Ryan was briefly at a loss for words. All that sneaking around, and it was just so you could have her to yourself. Chapter 16. A target found. Ryan immediately felt like he'd wasted a great deal of emotional investment. He'd imagined so many possibilities. Once he confirmed this man's only agenda was keeping his rendezvous to himself, Ryan stepped back and gave them some distance. He had no interest in eavesdropping. For him, theory had always been less appealing than practice, and observation far less satisfying than doing whether at school or anywhere else. He'd never had much interest in study materials or two-dimensional characters for that same reason. With that time, why not find a girlfriend? Isn't first-hand experience more interesting? Shame that in the end, games got in the way. He sighed. Before transmigrating, he hadn't so much as held a girl's hand. Entirely the game's fault. But he didn't leave. Even if the man's purpose had been anticlimactic, the man himself was still worth watching. In a slum where eating regularly was a question mark, making time for a secret meeting with someone was unusual in itself. Then again, it could be a genuine relationship. In a place with essentially no law enforcement, a bit of secrecy was hardly suspicious. He found a position that wouldn't lose sight of the exit when the man came back out, then settled in. The sounds from below were no longer audible, but knowing the two of them were down there doing whatever they were doing had a way of leading his thoughts somewhere unhelpful. Come to think of it, the big idiot was single, wasn't he? He checked confirmed. Partly because the big idiot had been deep in gambling during university, partly because his build was about as far from gentlemanly as you could get. Worse off than me. Ryan felt an unexpected flicker of sympathy for the man, which led him to seriously consider finding an opportunity to make up for both of their missed experiences. His circumstances, if you were being pessimistic, didn't allow him to make long-term promises to anyone. But nothing about a relationship required declarations of forever. He wasn't the type who thought emotion was a prerequisite for intimacy after all. Marriage itself wasn't necessarily built on feeling. That didn't mean he'd be careless about it. He just wouldn't invest out of loyalty. He'd invest because if you weren't going to take it seriously, what was the point of starting it? To cheat and enjoy the thrill of it? He understood the appeal of transgression as a concept. He just had no respect for actually stringing people along. Anyone who got themselves killed for it, he'd only think, you had it coming. For his own part, if he ever fell out of love or regretted a choice, he'd end the relationship or marriage first and then think about anything else. He had never feared change and never cared what anyone else thought of it. Once he decided something didn't fit, no amount of outside opinion would change that. He wasn't incapable of considering others' feelings, he just refused to sacrifice himself for them in matters of real importance. Same as when he'd chosen to work in a city far from home and only returned for the new year. He'd known how his family felt. It hadn't changed anything. His own feelings came first. Everything else was optional. The warmth of family harmony, parental understanding, devotion in a marriage, the approval of others, he was willing to work for these, but he wouldn't become dependent on them or treat any of them as non-negotiable. So the calculus was simple. If the risk of leaving his life incomplete outweighed the risk of complications, he'd take the chance. Having something within reach and letting it slip by for reasons that were ultimately avoidable, that was the kind of regret he genuinely couldn't accept. He'd always thought there was nothing wrong with enjoying the present. Giving up what you have now for some better option that might exist in the future struck him as foolish. Just don't let enjoyment make you blind to risks you could have foreseen. But after thinking it through at length, Ryan couldn't actually figure out how to pursue this without either making promises he couldn't keep or incurring risks he couldn't manage. He was an assassin, not a doctor. No means to assess certain kinds of risk. Other than not having to work, this transmigration doesn't seem to have changed much. His enthusiasm deflated slightly. Before transmigrating, his perpetual single status had been about more than just games. He didn't act on hope alone if there was a real chance it went wrong. Was that something he wanted to risk? Probably not. Desire was one thing, reckless pursuit was another. So for now, he put it away and decided to wait for the situation to clarify. Wonder if any supernatural ability can solve this problem. He filed the thought away with some genuine curiosity. Unmet expectations had a way of putting you on edge. And knowing the two people next door were in the middle of things was not helping. Eventually, patience running thin, Ryan decided to add a little excitement to the situation. Dislodging something in a half-collapsed ruin without making it look suspicious was trivially easy. With minimal effort, a protruding piece of rotten timber snapped with a sharp crack and fell, taking Ryan, who had been balanced only on the tips of his toes, along with it. The broken piece clattered and bounced down through the collapsed half of the ruin, raising a sound that was neither alarming nor exactly quiet. The noise from below ceased instantly. Ryan nodded, satisfied, and resumed his position. At least he felt better. And ideally, if the two of them finished early, he'd be able to follow the man and find out where he lived and what he did. Of course, wishing was one thing. With the goal of leaving no trace of his presence, there was only so much an assassin could do. Against ordinary people, an assassin didn't need to be this careful, but the church wasn't the only concern. What if one of the criminals operating in the slums happened to be an extraordinary? They were rare, but in a high-yield, high-risk profession, encountering a few wasn't out of the question. And Ryan still knew far too little about the supernatural abilities of this world. Without care, he might stumble into something with abilities so strange they defied logic and not even realize he'd been exposed. His own featherfall was one example. To anyone without prior knowledge of the assassin's abilities, catching one would be nearly impossible. The best defense against being detected was making sure no one knew you were there. The most perfect disappearance was to be overlooked entirely, not to vanish dramatically. As long as the slight man hadn't noticed he was being followed, and Ryan wasn't moving on him the same day, it didn't matter how strange and extraordinary abilities were, there was no foothold to work from. The perfect assassin should be completely undetectable until the objective is complete. He reminded himself quietly. He'd already transmigrated without warning into a strange world with supernatural powers. Without caution and discipline, he wouldn't survive 3 episodes. No rush. Think of it as practicing patience. Patience matters for an assassin. And who knows, maybe they're having dinner after. When no one appeared for a long stretch, Ryan let go of expectations. He started working on what any good hunter needed most: patience, while exploring ways to keep himself occupied without disrupting his observation or revealing his presence. And so, as the sun gradually sank, Ryan had mapped out all the viable observation positions in the immediate area, confirmed that shadow concealment only concealed items held close to his body, and was counting blades of grass on the ruin's floor when the 5'5" man finally and reluctantly took his leave. Finally. Not going to lie, with no phone, killing time alone like this is genuinely difficult. He exhaled and moved to follow. The sun had lowered enough that its intensity no longer posed a problem. The slight man stopped doubling back once he was clear of the area and broke into a quick jog. Running late for something? Ryan noted the urgency in his stride. Whatever his pace, keeping up with a man light as a feather was no effort at all. After tailing him for about 10 minutes, Ryan watched as the man approached an unremarkable building. "Where the hell have you been, you rat? You trying to starve me?" The man at the door spotted him instantly and launched a pitchfork in his direction before a word of greeting. Rat, apparently a nickname, sidestepped the throw and turned to respond, only to find his thrower already gone. Grumbling, Rat retrieved the pitchfork and took up the same spot by the door, standing guard himself. Interesting. From the shadows, Ryan studied the building and listened. He was fairly sure he'd passed through this area when mapping the district. Everything about it, what he saw and what he heard, had the feel of a small-time gang, the kind that collected protection fees and ran a few operations on the edge of legality, living marginally better than the honest laborers around them. But a low-level lookout having half an afternoon free to visit a lover and, from the sound of it, probably having brought her food at the very least, didn't quite fit that picture. The fish might be bigger than it looks. He allowed himself a quiet, satisfied nod. The sun hadn't completely set yet, and the building was clearly separated from those around it. The neighbors gave it a wide berth. Getting inside right now would be tricky. Better to wait until after sunset. He committed the location to memory and made his decision. Eat first. Make preparations. Having a concrete target ahead of him lifted something off his chest. People really do need something to look forward to. Having a goal right in front of you, there's no better feeling than that. He slipped away, quietly pleased. Author's note: this chapter wonder if any supernatural ability can solve this problem. March 13, 044 Anhue. There is, brother. Not just a free girlfriend, there's a whole football team available. The potion system caters to all sorts of unusual tastes. 2 likes. 2025-051, 3464 the 2nd of October 425 Shandong. There is, brother, there really is. Chapter 17 A Cautious Gang. Another 5 pence on dinner at the Kevin Bar. Afterward, Ryan used the surface of the Tassoc River beside the docks to get his first real look at his own face. It wasn't as imposing as he'd expected. Just an ordinary face with no strong defining features. The hair and beard were unkempt from long neglect, rough and coarse. What genuinely threw him off was the eyes. The big idiot's hair was the black he was used to, but the eyes were blue. Not unheard of in this world, but still something he had to adjust to. Once the sun had fully set, he made his way back to the building that housed the gang. The sunlight that would have hindered him was gone. He focused his attention and listened carefully. As expected, someone was keeping watch, guarding against slum residents who might try their luck under cover of darkness. The building had no windows or balcony, but several large holes that the occupants had probably knocked out themselves. At night, these were blocked with ragged blankets. No one was awake near them, and at a height a normal person could realistically climb, they weren't the only way in. The guards talked in low voices, exchanging topics of no real significance, making jokes they thought were funny but couldn't laugh at too loudly. Most of the building was asleep, the majority on the 1st and 3rd floors. The 4th floor was completely silent. The 5th, highest floor had exactly one sound: snoring. After listening for a while without picking up anything useful, he did 2 circuits around the building. Besides the sizable hole in the 3rd floor walkway he'd spotted during the day, he found a large opening on the backside of the 5th floor, apparently used for ventilation, and left unblocked. With shadow concealment eliminating the noise of movement, and the slums having no oil lamps to light anything, infiltrating was as easy as walking into his own home. He slipped through the 3rd floor opening without effort. No wonder they block it, it's cold. He pulled himself inward and noted it. He was actually a little disappointed. Aside from not entering through the front door, this felt nothing like sneaking into anywhere. No need to tread carefully, no need to be on constant alert. In this absolute darkness, he could stand directly in front of the guards and they'd see nothing. He scanned the doors along the corridor, cloth stuffed into the gaps at the bottom. Given the cold draft in the hallway, he didn't try any of them. Even if pushing them open made no sound, the cold air would be enough to wake whoever slept on the other side. He moved down to the 2nd floor and had a look around. He couldn't quite identify the feeling. He was wandering freely, everyone and everything in the building fully visible to him, while the guards, including Rat, remained completely oblivious, carrying on their conversation without pause. If he didn't have to be careful not to touch anyone, the whole scene might have given him the impression he was already dead, drifting through as a ghost. Pity I can't walk through walls or float. The ghost experience isn't quite complete. He kept the thought to himself. Featherfall was microgravity reduction, not the effortless levitation of a proper haunting. The 1st floor was noticeably more populated. Apart from the main entrance, every other door was open. Every stretch of floor large enough to hold a body was occupied, corridors included. No wonder they blocked the holes and don't post more guards, they don't need to. He understood it completely. None of this was an obstacle for an assassin. He took a careful look around. Though the general squalor and smell were the same as the floors above, the blankets on these people were measurably thicker, and the bodies beneath them measurably less gaunt. The 2 people he'd seen earlier in the day had been the thinnest in this group by some margin. They've come into money recently. But they've held back, haven't spent it. He made a mental note with a small question mark. From the outside, a complete rabble. You'd never notice anything off without looking this closely. Oddly disciplined, for the type. He thought quietly. Here's hoping they have a clever head running things. He added the prayer. Because the alternative was that someone had applied pressure forced this crew to keep a low profile. And money that had visibly improved their circumstances this much, whether a down payment or a reward, suggested whatever they'd been hired for was not small. Let's hope my luck isn't that bad. He grimaced slightly. He was already being more cautious than he'd planned. He'd originally thought about staying to watch the gang after taking what he came for, see if he could find a lead to the next target. Now he was considering whether to find a way to quietly tip off the police or the church instead. It all came down to what the gang's leader was being cautious about. 4th floor. The doors here showed obvious signs of age, so he didn't try them, only peering through gaps where they hadn't quite closed. 2 of the rooms had blankets and bread stored inside, winter supplies. 5th floor. At the end of the corridor, faint moonlight filtered in through the large forced opening. The conditions here were noticeably better, at least the doors weren't rotting. He tested the one farthest from the occupied room, a little friction against the floor, nothing else. Manageable. He kept careful track of the likely leader's breathing, unchanged snoring, no sign of awareness. He worked through the remaining rooms one by one. Aside from one that had been set up as a rough meeting room, the rest were empty. Whether they hadn't decided what to use them for yet, or hadn't gotten around to it, he couldn't say. He eased them all shut again, then positioned himself outside the last door, the leader's room. As a precaution, he used his own jacket to fill the gap between the door and the floor where it was closest, then slowly, carefully pushed the door open. Now this feels a little more like breaking in. Fortunately, whoever was inside gave him nothing to work with, no sound except snoring, right up until Ryan was fully inside with the door closed quietly behind him. He surveyed the room. It didn't look like a slum. He could practically see small stacks of banknotes waving at him. Setting the furnishings aside, the man was sleeping in an actual bed, humble as it was. He checked drawers and the wardrobe carefully and found no immediate surprises, though a shoulder holster in the wardrobe added a note of anticipation to what he might find in the cabinets. Locked away in here, then. His eyes settled on what he was mentally calling treasure chests. With night vision, picking locks was trivial. The technique was already there, the potion had included it. Yes, the assassin potion's knowledge base included lockpicking. He'd only realized it this afternoon while eating and thinking through the possibility of encountering a lock. Actually, he'd been mildly puzzled before about how the potion's knowledge covered things like firearm operation skills that seemed too recent. But given his already thoroughly unreasonable supernatural abilities, he'd decided not to overthink it. The simple locks here were no match for an assassin. Noise wasn't a concern either. The man's snoring was louder than any lock mechanism. He opened the first cabinet carefully. Looking at the contents, all £5 notes, his worry about a wasted trip dissolved. Ruan's paper currency came in 3 denominations: £1, £5, and £10. This was not money that a small-time slum gang should be anywhere near, let alone accompanied by a revolver and a substantial supply of ammunition. The notes in what was a decently-sized cabinet, 20 or so in total, looked sparse against all that space, but he reminded himself, this wasn't his world. One £5 note represented roughly 5 weeks of an ordinary worker's wages. He turned to the other 2 cabinets. One held an account book, daily income and expenses, but he couldn't find a record of the large sum. The other contained a collection of higher value goods, portable in principle, but not something he could easily slip into his jacket. He relocked those 2 and counted the money in the first, 20 notes. £100. 2 years of income for an ordinary worker who didn't spend a thing, and this was what remained. Pity there's no trace of where it came from. He'd have liked to know, not to get involved, but to pass the information to someone who could use it. He picked up the revolver. His form immediately became visible to himself as he held it. Simple interactions, pushing a door, working a lock, didn't break shadow concealment. But picking up an object to actively use it did, as it did now. Unless the object was very small. A revolver was not. To use something in concealment, it had to already be in hand when shadow concealment was activated, and it had to be carried flush against the body. A staff the length of a person, held out in front, can't be concealed. Tucked along your side with the length flat against the body, can be. As long as the vast majority of the object stayed in contact with you throughout, it wouldn't break the concealment. He checked the revolver, nothing distinctive, a plain model. Tested shadow concealment while holding it, confirmed that the portion of the barrel not pressed to his body didn't interfere with the ability. All of it's coming with me. He made the decision cheerfully. He locked the empty cabinet, slid the shoulder holster from the wardrobe, and slowly backed out of the room. He closed the door politely behind him and disappeared into the faint moonlight. He hadn't helped himself to any of the occupants on the way out, not because of squeamishness, but because killing them would change nothing, and a body count large enough to attract a church extraordinary's attention was the last thing he needed. Doing a good thing and then immediately torching the goodwill wasn't a trade worth making. Wonder if they'll notice tomorrow. He walked back with a small flicker of anticipation. Both because he wanted to see the chaos, and because if they tried to take it out on someone else, he'd have an excuse to test a few more of the assassin's capabilities. Tchem. Just as he finished securing the shoulder holster and settled the new revolver into place, he caught something on the street below, faint footsteps. 3 people. Moving fast, heading opposite to me. Who's out at this hour? He stopped. Chapter 18 The Methods of a Nighthawks. 3 of them. Fast. No lights. Is this a Church of the Evernight Goddess Nighthawks team on the job? Either way, having encountered them, there was no reason not to take a look. The reason he'd been so careful before, cautious enough that a low-level gang acting out of character was enough to make him abandon the idea of following the thread further, was precisely that he knew nothing about this world's supernatural abilities. Not knowing how far those abilities extended into things like reconstructing events, finding clues, and distinguishing truth from deception had left him passive and hesitant whenever anything hinting at an extraordinary was involved. The only way to change that was information. And information about something this valuable and dangerous wasn't the kind anyone gave away freely. As a self-taught independent with no organization and no mentor, watching other extraordinaries in action was genuinely the most reliable opportunity he had for a closer look at supernatural power. There was some risk of exposure, but it was safer than being the one being chased. Honestly, if approaching the Church's extraordinaries directly wasn't almost certain to result in immediate apprehension, and if the hidden supernatural organizations that might exist in the shadows weren't both impossible to locate and impossible to trust, Ryan would have sought a group and found someone to shelter under long ago. So when he recognized this was probably a Nighthawks team moving on a target, he didn't hesitate for a second before following. His assassin senses, sharp vision, sharp hearing, and the concealment that came with them were the not entirely sufficient foundation of confidence that let him do this at all. The footsteps he'd heard were actually very quiet, not enough to disturb anyone's sleep. Even his potion-enhanced hearing had only caught them because of the nighttime stillness. The 3 were moving at a solid pace on the ground, but not as fast as Ryan going across rooftops. Within seconds, 3 figures in black coats had appeared in his field of view ahead. He exhaled softly and began closing the distance, carefully. 3 figures in black, night vision confirmed, dark coats. Almost certainly Church of the Evernight Goddess Nighthawks. They appeared to have no ability to conceal their bodies or suppress sound. Or possibly they didn't need it at this stage before reaching the target. There was no need for stealth. The one in the middle, slightly ahead of the others, strongest physical conditioning. This pace was well within their capacity. The slight lead was probably pacing down for the others. Likely the highest sequence, most capable of the 3. The other 2's breathing was steady. Their reactions and speed while avoiding obstacles weren't much worse than his own without featherfall. Whether because their potion also favored agility, because their sequences were higher than his, or because he without featherfall simply wasn't all that agile, he genuinely couldn't say. He was still pondering that last possibility with mild dejection when the central figure, slightly ahead, turned and looked directly toward the rooftop where Ryan was positioned. The assassin's response was fast enough. He'd read the leader's slight deceleration and reacted before the turn completed, ducking instantly. He wasn't about to trust that shadow concealment would hold up to direct scrutiny. Standing on a rooftop staring back at someone was not a risk worth taking. A church of the Evernite goddess Nighthawks being able to pierce shadow concealment was entirely plausible. How did they notice me? From ahead, a short exchange. Captain. Young male voice. Nothing. Middle-aged male voice. Calm, steady. The kind of voice you knew belonged to someone formidable. The three didn't linger. Footsteps resumed within seconds. Ryan edged carefully around the wall, testing several times before confirming he wasn't being baited. So not spotted, just sensed that someone was watching him? That would explain stopping to look for only a few seconds and then moving on as if nothing had happened. But how did he do it? Intuition? It reminded him of his own ability, danger intuition. The potion's description: when danger is imminent, instinct provides a premonition of the threat. Since he couldn't exactly manufacture danger to test it on himself, he'd largely ignored this passive ability. Only now, watching the team leader's reaction, did he remember it existed. Plausible. Before he turned, there was no change in motion. I'd been keeping this 50-meter distance for a while, and they were walking into the wind. Smell was unlikely. If I stopped looking directly at him, would he still sense it? He decided to test it later. Before he could close the distance, the three ahead had already begun slowing. They'd arrived. Another stretch of ordinary slum. The three still hadn't spoken. The one called Captain stood still, the other two fanned out around him, scanning the surroundings, taking up a watchful perimeter. Ryan couldn't make sense of it. Aside from your two teammates, there's no one here. Do you need a target to use your ability? Is the captain replaying the events at this location? Or does this ability have a very wide range? The captain naturally wasn't going to answer him. All Ryan could do was guess. He was clearly searching for something. The question was how. He turned over his earlier speculation. A deity's full title was essentially a summary of the supernatural abilities acquired through their potion pathway. Applied to the current scene, he pulled his attention inward, focused everything on sound, and waited to see if anything unusual emerged that might confirm the theory. The captain's breathing was very light, like someone standing asleep. Ahead of him, a wider patchwork of breathing rose and fell in the rhythms of sleep. After a while, the captain opened his eyes and made a gesture. The three began moving again. If Ryan hadn't caught the shift in footsteps and the return of the captain's breathing to its normal rhythm, he might not have realized they'd left. Unusually quiet. It's the middle of the night, no conversation at all. This time the three stopped again after only a short distance. Same formation. Roughly 200 meters in a straight line from the last position. He noted it and began repeating what he'd done before. This time, he caught something different. Every 10 seconds or so, one person's breathing would suddenly become very shallow, their snoring diminishing noticeably, then return to normal 10 seconds later. His affecting the sleeping people. Sleep-related ability? Using their dreams to gather information? Or does anyone he touches while asleep simply reveal what he wants to know? Or can he only read people when they're already asleep? The Evernite goddess's title ran through his mind and opened up a cascade of possibilities. After another interval, the captain's even voice rose. Confirmed. The docks. Nothing required at all, and he already has what he came for. That's alarming. He glanced at the still sleeping figures, and added quietly to himself, and none of them know any of this happened. He'd need to be careful. Even being suspected by the Church of the Evernite Goddess was a risk. Once they came looking, he'd have no secrets. Unsettling as it was, Ryan followed anyway. He still hadn't resolved how the captain had sensed he was being watched. To control variables, he replicated his approach from when he first spotted the three, closing the distance slowly and carefully. But this time keeping his eyes only on the two others, with the captain's feet tracked only in his peripheral vision. They reached the docks without incident. At this hour and in this weather, only a handful of bars still had lights on. The docks had no real sleeping spots, too cold for anyone to nap at a bar table, and too expensive for most to spend the night with a street woman. Just as Ryan was puzzling over how the team would handle a target with no one sleeping nearby, the captain gave a concise description. Blue hair, brown eyes, square face. Wearing dockworker's uniform. The three separated immediately, produced what appeared to be police credentials, and began questioning people on the basis of plainclothes investigation. Ryan stared. Right. With the church's influence, getting their people police identifications would be trivial. Or they might genuinely be a specialized unit. Handling cases involving the supernatural isn't that exactly what a specialized police unit does? Once he framed it that way, the whole scene made perfect sense. Worth remembering. And this confirms it: the more powerful the extraordinary, the more sensitive. Glancing at them briefly is one thing, staring consistently gets noticed. The fact that he'd watched the two others for the entire route without either of them reacting suggested their range, even if they had something similar, was less than the captain's, certainly less than 50 meters, which had been his distance when the captain first turned. What sequence did you need to be to serve as a Nighthawks team captain? Experienced sequence 8, or sequence 7? He waited. When he started to feel genuinely tired, the three concluded their inquiries and reunited. After a brief exchange, they moved off toward the northwest end of the docks. Just as Ryan felt a flicker of excitement finally, a chance to watch extraordinaries actually fighting the Nighthawks delivered a comprehensive lesson in the difference between the self-taught and the trained. By the time he cautiously moved to a closer vantage, all he could see was the captain standing still in an open area. Before Ryan could wonder why the other two weren't on guard duty, they both emerged from somewhere, pushing a bound man ahead of them. The man had tried to resist. But every time he moved, his body slowed and his head drooped, the look of someone fighting sleep. His handlers would then kick him sharply to jolt him back to consciousness. The moment the pain cut through, he'd clear up again, only to have the cycle repeat. You are under arrest. Surrender, or we are authorized to use lethal force. The captain raised his revolver, aim steady, tone perfectly level. The only person left genuinely astonished was Ryan, watching from a distance. It's over already. Chapter 19. Premonitions. Long range. Instant activation. Sustained. Can even work without line of sight, given the right conditions. This is a joke. Ryan was stunned. I don't know anything. Arresting me won't help you. The man stated it plainly. I know. That doesn't mean you're useless. Walk time to confess at the church. The captain gestured for the man to go ahead, then turned to one teammate. Head back and have them ready. That appeared to be the end of it. The residual shock still fading, Ryan came to his senses, slipped away quietly, and had no desire whatsoever to find out where the Nighthawks were based. Knowing wouldn't do him any good. Unless it's a one-on-many scenario, that captain is virtually unbeatable in any normal fight. And the fact that he sent two people in to make the arrest tells you he's not defenseless while using his ability. The earlier perimeter guard was simply because there was nothing for them to do yet. He walked home, still turning it over. The more he thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. His own abilities had already made clear that supernatural power followed no rules, but this was something else. Even paired with an ordinary person who simply happened to be a good shot, this ability would be enough to threaten every extraordinary it could affect, short of a potion specifically built around defense, with resistance to physical harm that made vital organ hits meaningless. And in the slums, they were very purposeful. They clearly knew roughly what area the lead was in. Whether they swept it systematically or used some supernatural method to narrow the range is unclear. Given the brief exchange after the arrest, he leaned toward the latter. So long as some link existed, the Nighthawks had a way to find relevant information. Sounds a bit like object reading or divination for tracking. The big idiot had picked up enough by osmosis in a world with gods, using something closely connected to the target as a medium to provide direction and guidance was one recognized approach. In this world, with gods present, the knowledge wasn't hard to find if you looked for it. Places like the Kevin Bar's underground market always had occult-related books available, and this kind of knowledge circulated in those circles. The problem was that no one could say which parts were true and which weren't. Read too much and the false parts might do the misleading for you. It would be so useful to have some way of telling real from fake. He sighed to himself, drifting along the edge of a rooftop. Because Featherfall automatically deactivated whenever he had solid footing, the most efficient way to move as an assassin was to find surfaces that couldn't support him, normally keeping Featherfall continuously engaged. That meant avoiding anything flat. Which was why, when an uneasy feeling suddenly surfaced, he had no good foothold to catch himself. He managed to release Featherfall and adjust his posture quickly enough to land with at least some shock absorption rather than taking it full force. But the premonition proved faster than expected. Before he hit the ground, the now familiar wave of chaos and frenzy hit him again, the whispering in his ear returning. His shadow concealment failed instantly, and for a moment he lost the fine motor control needed to execute the roll properly. He hit the ground in an undignified heap. Fortunately, he'd spent the whole evening traveling via rooftop, so he was already close to his rented room. No one was around. The noise of the fall didn't register with anyone. Seriously? I was only a little scared, and you come for me like this. Knowing this was a normal occurrence made it easier to manage even while fighting the urge to wreck everything in reach. He had just enough mental space left over to think ridiculous thoughts. Known dangers were always less frightening than unknown ones. The episode passed before long. He was left on the ground with a twisted wrist and blooded knees, grimacing. Like a lump of something unpleasant. Shows up just long enough to ruin my day. Was that the danger intuition? Could have come a little sooner, that would have been great. I'm going to sleep. Whatever it is, it can wait until morning. Whatever motivation had remained evaporated entirely. Across the city, in the southern part of Moen's northwest district, the area residents generally referred to as the Angelka district, noticeably different from the more affluent neighborhoods further north despite sharing the same administrative designation. A Church of the Evernite Goddess Nighthawks team's captain, Alec Howard, was calmly reassuring the apologetic young man standing before him. You've done well. Get some rest. I underestimated their caution. And don't be too discouraged. Divination is just one tool. Interference is perfectly normal. Understood. Good night, Captain. May the goddess watch over you. The young man, clearly educated in his manner, bowed slightly and tapped 4 specific points on his chest, the symbol of the moon, the mark of the Evernite goddess. May the goddess watch over you. Alec Howard returned the gesture and the blessing, his hair carrying the faint grey of middle age. He watched the young man adjust his round-framed glasses and step out, then extinguished the lamp. The room fell dark, but his naturally deep blue eyes grew, if anything, a little brighter in the absence of light. As a devotee of the Evernite goddess, he had always preferred darkness to light. For most Nighthawks, the dark was not an obstacle, it was a source of strength. He leaned against the wall and studied the sleeping figure in worker's clothes in the silence of the room. Alec Howard murmured quietly to himself. Was it simply their caution? Or was there a high-rank entity involved, something that made the divination fail? Either way, the investigation would continue. Partly out of duty. And partly because, if he was being honest, it had been rather quiet lately. With the war's effects continuing to fade and the major churches all launching their most intensive crackdowns on heterodox cults in recent memory, the number of situations requiring Nighthawks' intervention had been declining in Moen as in many other cities. The next morning Ryan woke to find the minor injuries from his fall the previous night had completely resolved, leaving no lingering discomfort. Not that it occupied much of his attention. He skipped breakfast entirely, confirmed his previous night's takings were intact, and headed straight back to the slum district. He'd actually considered, the night before, stashing the money somewhere discreet and sleeping in the slums. But the potions episode had killed any motivation for a second trip. Now, rested and in genuinely good spirits, he had no intention of missing the show. Food could wait, the show couldn't. As for the money, he'd thought of a better way to handle it. It was daytime, though cloud cover or not, operating freely in daylight wasn't like moving at night. He wasn't going to create problems for himself just to catch the drama sooner. So even with a sense of urgency, he covered the distance to the slum district the conventional way, on foot. His arrival, however, was a disappointment. When he positioned himself near the gang's building and focused his hearing, no one inside seemed to know they'd been robbed. The building's shadow stretched long in the early morning light. Ryan moved right to the base of the wall to improve the sound pickup. After a while, he pieced it together. The gang's leader knew the £100 was gone. He'd simply reframed it. The money hadn't been stolen, it had been reclaimed. Someone had broken a rule. The consequences had followed. The whole building was now buzzing with speculation and curses, trying to work out who among them had violated terms and cost everyone their easy arrangement. What had been a straightforward deal, hardly any work beyond the usual protection fees, was now a ruined opportunity, and they'd have to start finding income from scratch. Rat was the one getting the most suspicion. His habit of disappearing at odd hours had apparently not gone unnoticed. Well, you're not entirely wrong, Rat. Just not for the reason they think. Ryan was privately delighted, though he kept it silent. But there really is someone running them. He noted it as he laughed. He checked the upper floors. The leader who'd been sleeping in the bed was gone. Out already. And this little gang genuinely seems caught up in something bigger. What do I do with that? He scratched his head as he made his way toward the Docklands. He turned it over all the way to the Kevin bar without arriving at anything satisfying. The 3 Nighthawks from last night had left too strong an impression. Any approach to tipping off the church or the police felt uncomfortably exposed. In the end, he gave up on the problem entirely. The Church of the Evernite Goddess was not going to be undone by the loss of one piece of information. Absolutely not. So he let it go, had a 5-pence breakfast at the bar, and then walked toward the Tassoc River. He'd worked it out that morning, coming into £100 and trying to use it in the same city, no matter how carefully, was too conspicuous if noticed. Moving to a different city was the safer approach. As for why he was heading to the riverbank rather than buying boat passage, the answer was simple. He was curious what would happen if an assassin with Featherfall active jumped into a river. He walked out of the Docklands and followed the Tassoc River downstream. Finding a section where the bank sloped gradually, he laid all his worldly possessions on the ground and weighted them with the revolver. Then, after a moment's thought, he spent considerable effort snapping off a fairly thick branch. Without further preamble, he hefted it like a club, took aim at the water's edge, and jumped. Just as he was curious to find out whether he could skim across the surface, a premonition of danger hit him. True to form, the next moment, on contact with the water, Featherfall cut out entirely. He went straight in. Author's note: this chapter even paired with an ordinary person who simply happened to be a good shot, this ability would be enough to threaten every extraordinary it could affect short of a potion specifically built around defense, with resistance to physical harm that made vital organ hits meaningless. 202409290137311189 The 2nd of December 454 Tianjin Bishop of the Rose. What's a vital organ, Guardian? What's getting hit by a bullet? Chapter 20. A note on update changes. First, I'd like to apologize to everyone reading. After trying it out for a few days, I've realized that daily updates of 6,000 characters is a bit too much for a new author like me. My current writing speed is just over 5,000 characters on a good day, with no interruptions. So going forward, I'll be going back to around 2,000 characters per chapter and posting at least 2 chapters a day, at 7 a.m. and noon. The extra 1,000 or so characters will roll over to the next day and combine with the following day's overflow, going out as a 3rd chapter at 5 p.m. That way updates will usually be 2 or 3 chapters a day. That's the ideal scenario, meaning no interruptions. I can only say I'll do my best. In terms of the weekly schedule, Tuesday through Thursday, I'll post however many chapters I've written that day. Saturday and Sunday are fixed at 2 chapters each. Monday, as a makeup day, is fixed at 3. Sorry again to everyone reading. I'll keep working at it, and hopefully I'll get to daily 6,000 before long. Chapter 21. Avignon City. Danger intuition does have its uses. At least I avoided being soaked from head to foot. Below the knees in the water, Ryan had to admit his opinion of the ability had shifted. The gap between the warning and the actual danger was short, but for an assassin's reaction time, there was still room to act. He'd managed to twist around and, the moment Featherfall cut out, drive the thick branch into the riverbank, and that was owed entirely to the premonition. Full force strike is also a bit unreasonable, honestly. Both hands still gripping the branch as it held him above the waterline, he found himself staring at the portion buried halfway into the bank and shaking his head. No time to think in the moment, he'd instinctively activated full force strike as he drove the branch down. That was why it had sunk so deep. He'd known full force strike didn't simply add force to his hands directly, but feeling a weapon pull his hands forward was still a thoroughly strange sensation. Enough to make me afraid of throwing a full force strike punch. Just imagining what that would feel like to his own hands made them ache preemptively. The slope was gentle, and his physical conditioning was well past ordinary, so hauling himself out of the river left him only slightly winded. More dramatic than dangerous. Even without the premonition, the worst outcome would have been getting wet from the chest down, which would have meant abandoning the plan, going back to change into dry clothes, and starting over. Not meaningfully different from the current situation. And the assassin potion focused primarily on agility, but that didn't mean everything else was untouched. Case in point, the branch that held his full weight had been snapped off by hand. Full force strike helped, yes, and his back and shoulders were still complaining, but it was still barehanded. Technically, he wrung out his trouser cuffs and shoes as best he could and didn't linger on it. He'd have to change anyway. After stowing everything safely, he set off jogging to warm his feet, keeping an eye out for animals along the way. He wanted to test whether shadow concealment suppressed scent. The docks and slums had nothing, not even stray dogs. And he wasn't about to use his abilities in the other two districts that left outside the city. Moen wasn't isolated in most ways, sitting near the Tassoc River, but it had no close neighboring cities. The climate and terrain around it weren't particularly developed. Past the outskirts, the wild wasn't far. With an assassin's senses, finding wildlife even in this weather wasn't difficult. Something to do while waiting for the boat. He thought about it pleasantly. There were no ticketed departures to wait for. Why buy a ticket when you could simply board without one? It saved money and left no record. Meanwhile, in a quiet, understated detached villa in Moen's northwest district, a strikingly beautiful woman stood before a mirror. She'd only just dressed and hadn't yet done her hair or applied any cosmetics, and yet the face reflected back was enough to make anyone stop. She reached for her brush, then set it down again. Her pale, flawless hand passed slowly across the surface of the mirror instead. The reflection blurred. The glass took on a dim luminescence, as if it had become a window into somewhere else entirely. In a moment or two, she saw the blur beginning to clear and turned the mirror to face another direction. "Beautiful lady, there has been a development in what you asked me to watch." A male voice emerged from the glass, slightly urgent. "Speak." Her voice was soft, but utterly without readable emotion. "One of the men who handled the goods was arrested by Nighthawks last night. And a gang involved in the exchange had the payment we made stolen, no trace left by whoever took it." A pause, and then the man's voice returned with a note of practiced flattery. The woman said nothing more. She passed her hand across the glass again and turned it back to face her. The mirror was ordinary once more. She continued her preparations at an unhurried pace, murmuring two words almost inaudibly. "The night before last night." She looked at herself in the mirror and broke into a sudden, radiant smile. By the Tassoc River, Ryan, having just confirmed he could not catch a rabbit with his bare hands, watched a wooden steam-powered cargo vessel moving downstream and broke into a smile of his own. A genuine one. The riverbank here was dense with trees growing close to the water. Even in daylight, an assassin's abilities were perfectly usable. The deck of the cargo vessel was occupied by a fair number of people, but he had no intention of boarding the deck. He only needed to hold on to the side of the hull, a passenger on the outside. The vessel continued downstream. No one noticed it had acquired an extra traveler. If the ship itself could have noticed, it probably would have assumed it had grazed a leaf drifting by. "Let's hope I don't get seasick." He held the thought with mild concern. Using this method, hanging on to vessels, releasing ahead of each city, then picking up the next one, Ryan arrived on the last ship of the evening at Avignon City, located in the southern part of Ahawa County. Unlike Moen, which could only communicate with other cities by river, Avignon had been incorporated into Ruin Kingdom's rail network, with convenient transport links in all directions. If you needed to, an hour was enough to reach the famous university city of Tingen. Another 4 hours beyond that, and you could see the capital Berklund itself, the city of cities, the land of hope, as people called it. If you were traveling through Ruin from the far north of Coldwinter County along the Tassoc River, Avignon City would be where the kingdom's prosperity first made a genuine impression on you. The reason he'd spent an entire day traveling here, beyond the convenient transport links and more developed economy that made any purchase easier than in Moen, was a gathering the big idiot had known about, a meeting of extraordinaries. Unlike the Kevin Barr's underground market, which was more accurately described as an occult hobbyist's flea market, gatherings like this were attended mostly by unaffiliated, self-taught extraordinaries. The assassin potion's first primary ingredient, the black feathers of the cockatrice, was something the big idiot had obtained at exactly this kind of event. But first, food. And it's time to do something about how I look. He pressed a hand to his flat stomach. Worried he might not make it to Avignon in a single day, he'd pushed through on the most economical option available, 4 rye loaves for the whole journey, even with £100 in his pocket. Just thinking about that texture, he wanted something decent to eat. But in his current state, no restaurant would let him through the door. Tonight, he'd have to make do. Tomorrow, once I've sorted myself out, something good to eat. Definitely. He made the promise quietly to himself. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Novels Wonderland.